There is a story that Australia tells about itself, a clean story. A story of convicts who became free men, of gold rush fortune seekers who built a nation from raw earth, of democratic federation achieved without revolution, of a continent that emerged from British colonial administration into self-governance through orderly negotiation and the patient drafting of a constitution. It is a story of institutions and acts of parliament and colonial governors and the slow extension of the franchise to more and more of the population. It is a story in which power flows from the Crown through official channels, and the records of that power are preserved in archives and documented in newspaper columns and debated in legislative chambers whose proceedings are available for anyone willing to look. That story is true, as far as it goes. But there is another story sitting underneath it, a story that is harder to see not because it was hidden in any simple sense, but because the people who lived it had no reason to make it visible. When you control the water rights of an entire river system, you do not need to announce that fact. When your family has been supplying the colonial government with provisions since the first decade of settlement, and your credit lines extend to every merchant of consequence in 3 colonies simultaneously, you do not need to hold public office to shape what the government does. When your lawyers wrote the terms of the land grants, and your ships carried the wool and your banks held the mortgages on everything else, the question of who was really in control was never a question that needed asking, because the answer was so obvious to everyone who mattered that stating it out loud would have seemed almost rude. Power of that kind does not leave the same kind of records as power exercised through official channels. It leaves traces. It leaves the negative space around decisions, the shape of what was not done as much as what was. It leaves the names that appear on founding documents in multiple colonies simultaneously, the same families appearing on the boards of the banks and the boards of the pastoral companies and the boards of the navigation companies and the donor lists of the churches and the membership lists of the clubs, where the decisions were actually made. It leaves the marriage records that reveal the network of connection beneath the surface of official history. And in some cases, perhaps the most interesting cases, it leaves the gaps, the names that were there in the original record and then, in a later edition or a compiled history or an official account, were quietly not there anymore. This is a story about those families, about the network of interconnected dynasties that shaped the Australian colonies before Federation in ways that the official histories have not always fully acknowledged, about the mechanisms by which real power operated in a colonial society, the land grants and the water rights and the pastoral leases and the merchant credit and the banking relationships and the shipping monopolies that translated colonial wealth into colonial control, about the specific families who sat at the center of those mechanisms and whose influence over the development of what would become Australia was, in its way, more significant than the influence of many of the official figures whose names appear more prominently in the history books, and about the question of why some of those names are harder to find than you would expect them to be, why some of the records are incomplete, why some of the family papers ended up in private collections rather than public archives, why some of the histories that were written about the colonial period in its early decades contain references that were edited out of later, more official accounts. Not a conspiracy, not a deliberate suppression in the dramatic sense, just the quiet and quite natural process by which people with significant interests in how history is remembered tend to shape the record in ways that serve those interests. Not lying, exactly. Just choosing what to emphasize and what to leave in the footnotes and what to simply not mention at all. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time is it. I always check the comments, and there is something that genuinely moves me about it. Someone in Melbourne at midnight, someone in Brisbane just before the rain, someone in London in the early morning who grew up in Australia and still thinks about it in the dark. We are all drifting together through a history that is stranger and more layered than the version we were taught. And tonight, we are going into the layers, into the spaces between the official names and the official records, into the story of how a continent was shaped by people whose power was real and whose names have become, over time, curiously difficult to find. Begin in Sydney. begin in the very earliest years of the colony, when the settlement at Sydney Cove was only a few years old and the question of what it was going to become was still entirely open. The convicts who had arrived on the first fleet were building a prison colony, in the most literal sense, barracks and stores and a hospital and a small government farm. The colony was intended to be self-sufficient, but was not, was intended to be orderly, but was struggling, was intended to be a solution to the problem of overflowing British prisons, and turned out to be a solution that created problems of its own almost immediately. Into this uncertain early settlement came the first generation of people who would recognize, before almost anyone else, what Australia could become if the right people were in the right positions, with the right resources at the right time. These were not convicts. They were not, for the most part, the official military officers of the colony, though some of them wore military uniforms and held military ranks. They were the entrepreneurs and the opportunists and the people with enough capital and enough connections and enough clear-eyed assessment of the situation to see that a new colony in a vast and largely unknown continent with a captive labor force and access to extraordinary natural resources and a government apparatus that was chronically underfunded and chronically dependent on private supply was an opportunity of staggering proportion. The name that looms largest in this earliest period, and the name that sets the pattern for everything that follows, is one that has been the subject of considerable historical debate, not about its prominence, which is undeniable, but about its moral character, which is complicated. John MacArthur, the wool pioneer, the man who almost single-handedly created the Australian fine wool industry by breeding merino sheep and advocating for the pastoral potential of the colony's interior. The man who was also, at various points, a duelist, a mutineer, a manipulator of governors, and one of the most single-mindedly self-interested operators in colonial Australian history. What the textbooks say about MacArthur is largely true. He did introduce merino sheep. He did establish the wool industry on a scale that would transform the colony's economy. He did have extraordinary vision about the agricultural potential of the land. But what the textbooks often understate, or mention briefly and then move on from, is the mechanism by which MacArthur translated that vision into control. The mechanism was land. Specifically, it was the acquisition of land on a scale that no individual in the colony's history had previously achieved, acquired at terms that MacArthur himself had a hand in negotiating from a government apparatus that was, during critical periods, either too weak to refuse him or too dependent on his cooperation to resist his demands. The grants that MacArthur received from the colonial government were not simply rewards for enterprise. They were the outcome of a relationship between a private interest and a public institution in which the private interest consistently had more leverage than the public institution. MacArthur knew what the colony needed. He knew what the governors needed, and he was willing to provide those things in exchange for the one resource that, in a land of limitless horizon, was the only thing that actually constrained what you could do, the legal title to a specific piece of it. Elizabeth Farm, which MacArthur established in the Parramatta district in the 1790s, was the first piece of what would become one of the most significant private landholdings in the early colony. But it was not the last. Over the following decades, through a combination of direct grants, purchases from others who had received grants but lacked the capital to develop them, and the kind of strategic marriage alliances that were as important in colonial Australia as they had been in medieval Europe, the MacArthur family accumulated land on a scale that gave them a structural influence over the colony's pastoral economy that no government policy could easily override. Here is what that structural influence meant in practice. If you needed to sell wool, you needed access to the market that the major pastoral operators controlled. If you needed credit to develop your land, you needed access to the banking relationships that the major pastoral families maintained with London houses. If you needed labour, in a colony where convict assignment was managed through a system that gave considerable discretion to government officials who were themselves embedded in networks of relationship with the major landholders, you needed to be on the right side of those networks. The MacArthurs sat at the centre of all of these systems simultaneously. They were not just wealthy, They were structurally necessary, in the sense that removing them from the economic picture would have required rebuilding major parts of the colonial economy from scratch. This is what the textbook portrait of MacArthur as a wool visionary misses. The vision was real, but the vision was inseparable from the structural position that made the vision achievable, and that the vision, once achieved, reinforced. MacArthur's descendants would maintain a version of that structural position for generations, adapting it as the colonial economy evolved, maintaining the family's presence at the center of the pastoral industry and the banking industry and the political networks that governed both. But the MacArthurs were not alone. They could not have been, because the kind of structural influence they wielded required a network. No single family, however wealthy and however strategically positioned, could control the colonial economy in isolation. What the MacArthurs needed, and what they found, were families who held complementary pieces of the same structural position. Families who controlled the shipping, families who controlled the banking, families who controlled the retail supply chains, families who had the political connections that even the most economically powerful pastoral family needed when the government's decisions affected the terms of their landholding. One of the most important of these complementary families, and one whose name has faded from the popular historical consciousness more thoroughly than its actual influence warrants, was the Wentworth family. Not William Charles Wentworth, the constitutionalist and advocate for colonial self-government, whose name is relatively well known, but the broader network of the Wentworth connection, the web of relationship and obligation that William Charles inherited and extended, and that gave the family an influence in New South Wales that operated simultaneously in the pastoral economy, the legal profession, the newspaper publishing business, and the emerging colonial politics of the pre-responsible government era. William Charles Wentworth was the son of Darcy Wentworth, whose own story is one of the stranger entries in early colonial history. Darcy Wentworth had arrived in New South Wales under circumstances that he spent the rest of his life carefully managing the public perception of. He had been tried in England on charges of highway robbery, acquitted, tried again on similar charges, acquitted again, and then sailed to Australia as a ship's surgeon on a convict transport rather than as a convict himself, a distinction that was legally meaningful and socially significant, but that sat uneasily in the colonial milieu where everyone knew that the acquittals had been narrow and the circumstances had been ambiguous. Darcy Wentworth's response to this ambiguous beginning was to make himself indispensable. As principal surgeon at Sydney Hospital and later as superintendent of police in New South Wales, he occupied positions of genuine institutional authority. But more important than the official positions were the unofficial ones. Darcy Wentworth was a silent partner in the trading operations of Simeon Lord, who was among the most commercially successful of the emancipist merchants in early Sydney. He had interests in landholdings that he managed through arrangements that kept his name off the primary documentation. He was, in the language of a later era, a person of considerable beneficial interests in enterprises whose official face was someone else's. His son, William Charles, inherited both the family's ambiguous social position and its substantial economic resources, and he deployed those resources with a strategic intelligence that his father would have recognized and admired. The land that the Wentworth family accumulated in the Bathurst district and beyond was acquired partly through William Charles's own grants and purchases, but also through a pattern of arrangement with other families that was characteristic of how the colonial gentry operated. You acquired land adjacent to land held by your network. You managed it through combined operations that reduced the overhead for all parties, and you developed relationships with the London capital markets that allowed the network as a whole to access credit on terms that no individual member of it could have obtained alone. William Charles Wentworth's newspaper, The Australian, was not simply a vehicle for his political views, though it was certainly that. It was also an instrument of network maintenance. The positions it took on land policy and transportation and the terms of colonial governance were positions that reflected and reinforced the interests of the pastoral network that Wentworth represented. The advocacy for squatters' rights, the opposition to mechanisms that would have made land more accessible to smaller operators, the arguments about the appropriate pace of the transition to responsible government. All of these were political positions that also happened to be the positions most favorable to the structural interests of the large pastoral families who were the primary beneficiaries of the existing land tenure arrangements. None of this is secret exactly. The connection between Wentworth's political advocacy and his economic interests has been noted by historians. But the full picture of the network in which Wentworth operated, the web of family connection and commercial relationship and mutual obligation that gave the advocacy its institutional weight, has received less attention than the advocacy itself, which means that what gets remembered is Wentworth the constitutionalist, Wentworth the advocate for colonial self-government, Wentworth the father of Australian democracy in the popular imagination, rather than Wentworth the centerpiece of an economic network whose structural interests his constitutional advocacy primarily served. Travel now from Sydney West across the Blue Mountains to the pastoral districts, to the great runs of the interior where the squatters, that very specific class of people who moved into country before the government had formally surveyed and opened it for settlement, established the claims that would become the foundation of some of the most significant private fortunes in colonial Australian history. The squatters occupy an interesting place in Australian historical memory. On one hand, they are the heroic pastoral pioneers, the men who pushed into unknown country with their flocks and their station hands and their rough bush skills and opened up the interior to European settlement. On the other hand, they are the people who, by getting there first and establishing de facto claims to vast areas of Crown land, locked up the pastoral resources of the colonies in a way that would generate political conflict for decades and that would profoundly shape the distribution of economic opportunity in colonial Australia. The families who moved into the squatting districts in the 1830s and 1840s, in New South Wales and in what would become Victoria and Queensland, were not simply adventurous individuals striking out into the unknown. The most successful of them were operating within networks of capital and connection that gave them advantages their competitors could not match. They had access to stocking capital from the London wool broking houses that wanted to secure their supply of high-quality Australian wool. They had legal advisors who understood the evolving regulatory landscape of squatting tenure better than most government officials did. And they had political connections that allowed them to influence the terms of the leasehold arrangements that would eventually be formalized. Among the families who operated at this level, one of the most significant and one of the least remembered in proportion to its actual influence is the family that controlled the Clyde Company, a pastoral enterprise established by Scottish investors that became, in the 1830s and 1840s, one of the largest pastoral operations in the Port Phillip district, and that provides an unusually clear window into how the network of capital and connection actually functioned in practice. The Clyde Company was structured as a partnership between Scottish investors, primarily from the merchant class of the central Scottish lowlands, and colonial managers who provided the on-the-ground knowledge and operational capacity. The investors provided capital, the managers provided presence and expertise. Both parties provided, through their respective networks, the political and commercial connections that allowed the enterprise to navigate the regulatory environment of a rapidly changing colony. The profits, which were substantial in good years and marginal in bad ones, but which over the long run represented a significant return on the Scottish capital invested, flowed back through the wool-broking houses to the original investors, who sat in their counting houses in Glasgow and Edinburgh and collected the returns from a continent they had never seen. This pattern of metropolitan capital extracting returns from colonial enterprise through networks that included both the formal channels of the London wool market and the informal channels of political connection and social relationship is the pattern that underlies most of the significant private fortunes of the colonial period. The names of the colonial operators appear in the colonial records. The station managers, the squatting licensees, the men who applied for and received the pastoral leases, the names of the metropolitan investors, the people whose capital made the whole enterprise possible, are often harder to find, buried in the private correspondence of wool-broking houses and in the account books of Edinburgh merchant partnerships that have not all survived in accessible form. This is not the result of deliberate concealment. It is the result of the difference between the kinds of records that formal legal processes create, which are preserved because the law requires them, and the kinds of records that private commercial arrangements create, which are preserved only if someone thought to keep them and thought to make them accessible. The gap between these two kinds of record is where a significant part of the real history of colonial Australian wealth creation lives. Now move further north and west. Move into the territory that would become Queensland, which was separated from New South Wales in 1859, and which presented a specific set of opportunities and specific set of challenges that attracted a specific kind of operator. The pastoral runs of Queensland were further from the Sydney markets, more remote from the shipping infrastructure, more exposed to the particular difficulties of tropical and subtropical climate. But they were also, for anyone with the capital and the connections to operate at scale, capable of generating returns on wool and cattle, and later on sugar and mining that were extraordinary. The families who established themselves in Queensland's pastoral and commercial elite in the decades between separation and federation were, in many cases, branches or associates of the networks that had already been established in New South Wales and Victoria. Capital moved between colonies. Marriage connections moved between colonies. Legal and commercial partnerships moved between colonies. The colonial gentry of Australia was not a set of separate colonial aristocracies. It was a single network, operating across colonial boundaries, using the colonial legal structures as convenient frames, but not as genuine containers for its activities. One of the most significant of the Queensland pastoral families, and one whose influence in the pre-Federation period was exercised through mechanisms that the standard historical accounts have not always traced in full, was the family of Robert Ramsay Mackenzie, who served as Queensland's third colonial treasurer and who operated simultaneously with that official role as a partner in one of the colony's most significant pastoral enterprises. The combination of official financial responsibility and private commercial interest in the same individual was not unusual in the colonial period. The expected standard of separation between public role and private interest was simply different from what we would now consider appropriate, and the men who operated at the intersection of official and private power in the colonial period were operating within a system that accepted and even expected that intersection. What is interesting about Mackenzie is not the fact of the intersection, which was entirely normal for his time and place, but the specific ways in which his official decisions and his private interests reinforced each other, and the ways in which his family's subsequent history reveals the long-term consequences of the structural position he occupied. The pastoral runs that the Mackenzie family interests held in Queensland benefited from water rights arrangements and access to stock routes that were determined by colonial government policy. The colonial government policy was shaped, during critical periods, by men who held interests in those same pastoral runs. The circularity of this arrangement was not a corruption in the legal sense. It was a feature of the system. The Mackenzie family connection extended, through marriage and commercial partnership, to a network that included some of the most significant financial institutions of colonial Queensland. The banking relationships that sustained the pastoral enterprises through the drought years and the boom and bust cycles of the colonial wool market were not simply commercial relationships. They were relationships embedded in the same network of social and familial connection that characterized the colonial gentry across all the Australian colonies. The men who sat on the boards of the Queensland colonial banks were often the brothers or the cousins or the brothers-in-law of the men who held the pastoral leases. The decisions about which pastoral enterprises would receive credit and on what terms were made within a social context that made completely impartial assessment of creditworthiness essentially impossible, even if that had been the intention. It was not always the intention. This is one of the things that makes the history of colonial Australian finance interesting. The colonial banking system was not simply a neutral allocator of capital. It was a social institution, embedded in the networks of the colonial gentry, reflecting the interests and the priorities of the people who ran it, shaped by relationships of personal trust and mutual obligation that were inseparable from the family networks of the colonial elite. Understanding who controlled the banks means understanding who controlled the pastoral economy, which means understanding who controlled the colony's economic future, which means understanding something important about why the colonial period developed as it did and why certain families emerged from it with lasting structural advantages. The name of Gibbs does not appear in most Australian history textbooks. It does not appear in the popular accounts of the colonial period. It does not appear, for the most part, in the narratives of Australian economic history that circulate in the general culture, but in the private correspondence of the London wool-broking houses, in the ledgers of the early Sydney merchants, in the records of the colonial land grant system, and in the marriage records of the colonial gentry. The name appears with a frequency that suggests it was considerably more important in the actual exercise of commercial power in the early colonial period than its subsequent obscurity would indicate. The Gibbs family, primarily through the firm of Gibbs, Bright and Company and its colonial offshoots, provided the financial architecture through which a significant portion of the colonial wool trade was organized. Not at the producing end, where the pastoral families held the land and managed the flocks, but at the marketing end, where the wool moved from the colonial shearing sheds through the warehouses and the auction floors and the shipping agents and the London brokers to the mills of Yorkshire and Lancashire. The margin between the price paid to the colonial producer and the price received from the English buyer was the margin in which firms like Gibbs operated, and that margin, multiplied across the volume of wool that was moving through the system by the middle of the 19th century, was substantial. More important than the margin itself was the role that the wool-broking houses played as intermediaries of credit. The pastoral economy was a long-cycle economy. Sheep took years to reach full production. Runs took years to develop to their productive potential. The capital requirements of establishing and maintaining a significant pastoral enterprise extended over time horizons that exceeded the financial capacity of most individual operators. The wool-broking houses provided the credit that bridged that gap, advancing funds against future wool clips, financing the stocking operations that expanded the producing capacity of the runs, and in doing so, acquiring a grip on the pastoral enterprises that their clients might not always have fully understood when they first took the credit. The relationship between the colonial pastoral families and the London wool-broking houses was, in many cases, a relationship of dependency that developed gradually and was difficult to exit once established. You took the credit when the times were good because the credit allowed you to expand. When the times were bad, the credit became the mechanism by which the broking house could, if it chose to, exercise very significant influence over the decisions of the pastoral enterprise that owed it money, not always in ways that were adverse to the pastoralist's interest. Often, the relationship was genuinely supportive, and the London houses had good reasons to want their colonial clients to succeed. But the structural reality of the relationship was that the colonial pastoralist who carried significant obligations to a London wool-broking house was not entirely free to make his own decisions about how to manage his enterprise. The Gibbs operation in Australia was managed through a series of colonial agents who appeared in local records as the faces of the enterprise. The London principals, whose capital ultimately underwrote the colonial operations, were less visible in the colonial record. This pattern of colonial agents as the publicly visible layer and metropolitan capital as the functionally controlling layer is characteristic of how British commercial capital operated in the colonial period generally. And it means that the full picture of who was really controlling the colonial economy requires looking not just at the names that appear in Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane, but also at the names that appear in the London records, the principals of the broking houses and the commodity traders and the merchant banks that provided the capital that made the colonial economy function. The woman in the story of colonial Australian power is almost always invisible in the official record. The land grants were made to men. The pastoral licenses were held in men's names. The banking partnerships were formed between men. The commercial agreements and the colonial legislative records and the official correspondence are documents of a world in which women did not hold formal economic or political power. And yet the women of the colonial gentry were not without influence. They were the agents of the network maintenance that was as important to the colonial elite as any formal commercial arrangement. They carried the relationships. They maintained the connections. They negotiated, through the management of social occasions and the arrangement of marriage alliances, the terms of the social compact that bound the colonial families together. The marriage records of the colonial period, when read as a network analysis rather than as a simple genealogical record, reveal the architecture of the colonial elite with a clarity that no other source provides. You can see, in the patterns of marriage between families, which groups were allied and which were competing, which families were in the ascendant and which were in decline, which networks were stable and which were being renegotiated. You can see the strategic logic beneath the individual decisions, the repeated pattern of connections between families who were also commercial partners, who also appeared together on the boards of colonial institutions, who also shared legal advisors and shipping agents. One of the most revealing examples of this network maintenance through marriage is the pattern of connection between the pastoral families of New South Wales and the families of the colonial legal profession. The lawyers who managed the land grant applications, who drafted the squatting licenses, who advised on the interpretation of the evolving land tenure legislation, who represented the pastoral interests before the colonial courts and the legislative councils, were not simply service providers to the pastoral families. They were, in many cases, related to those families by marriage, embedded in the same social networks, present at the same occasions, members of the same clubs. The professional relationship was also a personal relationship, which meant that the advice the lawyers gave was not always given from a position of complete independence from the interests of the clients they served. The legal families of the colonial period, the families that produced generation after generation of barristers and solicitors who served the colonial establishment, are among the most interesting and least examined components of the colonial elite. Their names appear consistently in the records of the institutions through which colonial power was exercised. They appear in the records of the colonial courts. They appear in the records of the colonial legislative councils as members and as draftsmen of legislation. They appear in the records of the land grant system as advisors to the grant applicants. And they appear in the marriage records, connected by family to the pastoral and commercial families whose interests their legal work served. The combination of legal expertise and social connection gave these families an influence that was perhaps more durable than the pastoral wealth of the squatting families, which was subject to the volatility of the wool market and the drought cycle. Legal expertise could be maintained and transmitted across generations in ways that land wealth sometimes could not. The family that produced a succession of competent lawyers who served the colonial elite had a structural position in the colonial economy that did not depend on any single asset or any single commercial relationship. It depended on the continuing need of the colonial establishment for legal services and on the continuing ability of the family to provide those services at the level of quality and connection that the elite expected. There is a building in Melbourne, a private club of the kind that colonial cities built when they were trying to establish the institutions of a civilized social order, whose membership list from the 1870s and 1880s reads like a complete diagram of the colonial establishment. Every pastoral family of consequence in Victoria, every significant commercial and banking family, the judges and the senior barristers and the colonial officials who had made themselves indispensable to the administrative machinery, the newspaper proprietors whose papers shaped the colonial public's understanding of what was happening and what it meant. All of them in the same building, on the same evenings, in the same rooms, having the same conversations that shaped the decisions that shaped the colony. The membership list of that club is a document of real historical significance because it maps the network in a way that the formal records of the colonial economy and colonial politics do not. The formal records show individual transactions and individual decisions. The club membership list shows the social context in which those transactions and decisions were embedded, the pre-existing relationships and mutual obligations that gave them their character. But club membership lists are not always easy to access. They were not public documents. They were maintained by the clubs for their own purposes, and they have survived in different states of completeness in different institutional archives. Some clubs have deposited their historical records in state libraries. Others have kept their records in private collections. And the records that survive in private collections are, almost by definition, accessible only to those who have the connection to the private collector to obtain access. which means that a significant part of the social history of the colonial elite survives in a form that is available to family researchers and to academics, with the right connections but not to the general public, and not to the casual student of history. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply how private records work. But the effect of it is that the picture of the colonial elite that is available to general readers, the picture that shapes popular historical understanding of the period, is the picture that emerges from the public record, from the formal archives and the published histories and the newspaper databases. And that picture, accurate as far as it goes, is less complete and less revealing about the actual mechanisms of power than the fuller picture that emerges when you add the private records to the public ones. The families who held real structural power in colonial Australia were, in many cases, precisely the families who had the most control over which of their records entered the public domain and which remained in private hands. The pastoral family that donated its correspondence to a state library donated the correspondence it chose to donate. The legal family that deposited its papers in a university archive deposited the papers it chose to deposit. The rest, the papers that revealed the more delicate aspects of the family's operations and relationships, might be retained in private family collections, or might have been destroyed, or might simply never have been systematically organized in a way that would make them accessible to a researcher even if the family were willing. The pastoral panic of the 1890s is one of the most significant events in Australian economic history, and one of the most revealing because the collapse of the boom exposed the underlying architecture of the colonial economy in ways that the boom years had kept obscured. When the banks began to fail, when the pastoral enterprises that had been mortgaged to the point of fragility began to collapse under the weight of drought and falling wool prices and the sudden withdrawal of London credit, the question of who owned what and who owed what to whom suddenly became very urgent and very visible. The crisis forced a transparency that the good years had not required. What the crisis revealed was the extent to which the colonial economy had been built on credit that was simultaneously more extended and more concentrated than most contemporary observers had understood. The credit had been extended through networks of relationship that were also networks of obligation, and when the credit contracted, the obligations that had seemed comfortable and sustainable suddenly became crushing. Families that had appeared wealthy by the standards of the colonial establishment turned out to have wealth that was largely nominal, representing the capitalized value of pastoral enterprises that were themselves largely mortgaged to London wool-broking houses or to the colonial banks that were in turn borrowing from London. The families that survived the crisis intact and the families that did not tell a revealing story about where the real strength in the colonial elite had actually resided. The families that had combined pastoral wealth with banking interests and legal connections and urban commercial activities were generally better positioned to survive than the families that had invested all their resources in pastoral, land. The diversified family, the family that had brothers-in-law and brothers in banking and brothers in commerce as well as brothers running the stations, was structurally more resilient than the undiversified family that had put everything into the pastoral enterprise. And the families that had maintained their metropolitan connections, that had preserved the relationships with the London merchant banking houses that provided the credit on which the colonial economy depended, were in the best position of all. Because in a crisis, the entity that controls the credit controls the outcome, and in the colonial period, the ultimate control of credit rested not in Sydney or Melbourne, but in London, in the counting houses of the city, in the offices of the wool-broking firms and the merchant banks that had financed the development of the Australian pastoral economy and that now held, as the collateral for that financing, claims over a significant portion of the colonial pastoral wealth. The families that had managed to establish direct relationships with those London institutions, that had cultivated the personal connections that allowed them to negotiate their obligations during the crisis rather than simply submitting to their consequences, were able to restructure their affairs in ways that left them with reduced but surviving fortunes. The families that had operated entirely at the colonial level, that had borrowed from the colonial banks and through them from London without establishing direct relationships with the London principals, had much less room to maneuver. This difference in resilience mapped almost perfectly onto the network structure of the colonial elite. The families at the center of the network, the families that had been in Australia longest and had developed the most extensive connections both within the colonies and back to Britain, were the most resilient. The families at the periphery of the network, the more recent arrivals or the more geographically isolated operations, were the most vulnerable. The crisis of the 1890s was, among other things, a test of the colonial elite network, and the network's center survived it much better than the periphery. The specific question of names removed from records is one that requires care because the evidence for deliberate removal is less clear than the evidence for the kind of selective emphasis and omission that shapes most historical records. There are genuine cases of document destruction, of family papers that were disposed of when they became inconvenient, of records that were removed from institutional archives and have not been seen since. But these cases need to be distinguished from the more common phenomenon of records that were never made in the first place, or that exist but have not been found, or that are available but have been overlooked by historians whose attention has been focused elsewhere. What can be said with some confidence is this. The histories of the Australian colonial period that were written in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the period when the colonial gentry was transitioning from its dominant position in colonial life to a still influential but less unchallenged position in the post-Federation society, reflect the perspectives and the priorities of the class that commissioned and consumed them. These histories celebrated the achievements of the pastoral pioneers and the commercial builders of the colonies. They noted the political contributions of the constitutional advocates and the parliamentary leaders. They recorded, carefully and admiringly, the biographies of the men who had led the colonial establishment from its foundation to its maturation, but they were not histories designed to reveal the mechanisms of power. They were histories designed to celebrate achievement. And achievement, in the framework of their authors and their audiences, meant the outcomes. The wool production statistics, the pastoral expansion, the banking institutions established, the cities built, the constitution drafted. The process by which those outcomes were achieved, the networks of relationship and obligation and mutual interest that shaped the decisions that produced the outcomes, was not what the histories were interested in. It was the background against which achievement occurred, and, like all backgrounds, it was mostly left unexamined. Some of the names that appear in the private records of the period, the correspondence and the ledgers and the partnership agreements, are genuinely difficult to find in the published histories. Not because anyone went through the published histories and crossed them out, but because the published histories were organized around a different set of questions and a different set of criteria for significance. The wool-broking firms that provided the capital are less visible than the pastoralists who used it, because the broking firms were not in Australia, and their story was not the colonial story that the colonial histories were interested in telling. The legal families that maintained the network through their professional service are less visible than the political figures they advised, because the advisors are always less visible than the figures they advise. The wives and mothers and daughters who carried the social network that made the commercial network possible are least visible of all. This is the kind of removal that most needs to be recovered. Not the dramatic removal of the document from the archive, though that happens too, but the systematic de-emphasis of the infrastructure of power in favor of the visible exercise of it. The choice to write about the men who signed the papers rather than the networks that shaped what the papers contained. The choice to count the acres granted rather than to examine the relationships that determined who got the grants. The choice to celebrate the pioneers rather than to analyze the system that made pioneering possible and profitable for some people and not for others. Victoria in the 1850s and 1860s was a different world from the pastoral New South Wales of the first decades of settlement. The gold rushes had created a demographic explosion and an economic disruption that shook the existing order in ways that the squatting families found deeply unsettling, and that the commercial families, the ones quick enough to adapt, found genuinely transformative. Gold brought people who had no attachment to the existing colonial hierarchy, who owed nothing to the pastoral establishment, who had come to Australia not to serve the system but to find the thing that would allow them to exit the system entirely. And among those people, there were some who found it. But what happens to wealth when it is found in a gold field? It needs to be transported and exchanged and stored and deployed. The infrastructure for those functions existed in the Victorian gold rush period, primarily in the hands of the families that were already established in colonial commerce. The men who found the gold needed banks to deposit it in, stores to buy their supplies from, shipping agents to arrange their return passage if they chose to leave, and lawyers to manage whatever legal complications arose. All of those services were provided by the commercial establishment of Melbourne, which was, in the gold rush period, in the process of rapid and transformative expansion, but which was still controlled by families that had established themselves in the pre-gold period and that used the gold rush as an opportunity to extend and consolidate their positions. The banking family that became most significant in this context, and whose name is not as well known as it deserves to be, given its actual importance in the financial history of Victoria, was the family and network associated with the Bank of Australasia in its Victorian operations. The bank, which had been established with British capital to serve the colonial pastoral economy, found itself at the centre of the gold rush economy. Not because it had planned for that role, but because it was the institution in Melbourne with the clearest claim to handling large deposits of gold on behalf of people who had no other good option for securing their sudden wealth. The men who managed the bank's Victorian operations during this period were not celebrities. They were not the faces of the gold rush in any public sense. But they were making decisions about credit and deposit and exchange that affected the financial outcomes of thousands of people, and those decisions were made within the framework of values and priorities and relationships that they had brought with them from the existing colonial establishment. The gold rush created new wealth. The banking system shaped how that wealth was deployed. And the banking system was controlled by people who were embedded in the existing networks of the colonial elite. This is not a story of simple corruption. The bank's managers were, for the most part, doing their jobs as they understood them. But the values that shaped how they understood their jobs, the frameworks within which they assessed creditworthiness and allocated credit and made the decisions that determined who would be able to use their gold rush winnings to build lasting enterprises and who would not, were the values of a specific social class with specific interests and specific networks of obligation. And the people who benefited from those decisions were, not always, but often enough to be significant, people who were already connected to the networks that the bank's managers inhabited. There is something worth pausing on here before we move further. The story of colonial wealth accumulation has a rhythm to it, a repeating pattern that once you see it, you cannot unsee. The pattern is this: first mover advantage, converted into regulatory capture, consolidated through social network, transmitted through family and marriage, an educational institution, and maintained through the informal mechanisms of club and church and professional association that operated beneath the formal level of democratic governance. Every family we have examined in any detail has followed some version of this pattern. The specific details vary. The timing varies. The specific industries and the specific mechanisms vary. But the underlying logic repeats, reliably enough that it begins to feel less like a series of individual stories and more like a system, a colonial system that generated concentrated advantage for specific families as one of its characteristic outputs. The Pacific trade, which is one of the less examined aspects of Australian colonial economic history, he was controlled in the second half of the 19th century by a small number of firms that operated out of Sydney and Melbourne and that had no significant competition from any other Australian commercial interest. The firms that dominated the Pacific trade did so through a combination of first-mover advantage, established relationships with Pacific Island trading partners, and the kind of political connection that allowed them to influence colonial government policy toward the Pacific in ways that reinforced their existing competitive positions. The names of these firms appear in the shipping records of Sydney and Melbourne and in the correspondence of the colonial governments that were navigating the complex politics of the Pacific in the era before Federation. They appear in the records of the Queensland government's attempts to control the labour trade from the Pacific Islands to the Queensland sugar fields. They appear in the records of the diplomatic exchanges between the Australian colonies and the Pacific Island territories that Britain was in the process of absorbing into its imperial system. And they appear consistently in the passenger lists and cargo manifests of the ships that connected the Australian colonies to the Pacific world, but they appear less consistently in the popular histories of the period, which have tended to focus on the political story of Australia's relationship with the Pacific, the annexation debates and the labour trade controversies and the diplomatic exchanges, rather than on the commercial story of the firms that were simultaneously conducting the trade and lobbying the governments about the terms under which that trade should be regulated. The political story and the commercial story are inseparable, but the histories have often treated them separately, which has made it easier to overlook the ways in which the commercial interests of the Pacific trading firms shaped the political positions that the colonial governments took. One family whose name appears in the Pacific trade records with particular frequency, and whose influence over the colonial government's Pacific policy in the crucial period of the 1870s and 1880s, has not received adequate historical attention, is the family associated with the firm of Burns, Philp and Company in its early years. The firm that would eventually become one of the most significant commercial enterprises in Australian history began as a trading operation in Townsville in the 1870s, with interests in the Pacific trade that developed alongside its Australian activities. The men who built the firm and the political relationships they cultivated with Queensland colonial government officials are part of a story about the intersection of commercial interest and colonial policy that has been told only in fragments in the published literature. The gaps in that story are not accidental. They are the result of the kind of selective historical attention that consistently focuses on the official record and the formal decision-making process, while underweighting the informal networks and private relationships that shaped those decisions. The correspondence between the Burns-Philp partners and the Queensland colonial officials who were formulating Pacific policy is preserved in some form in various archives. But the reading of that correspondence that would fully illuminate the reciprocal nature of the relationship, the ways in which the firm influenced policy, and the ways in which policy protected the firm's competitive position, has not yet been done in the systematic way that would bring the full picture into focus. Federation, when it came, was not simply a constitutional event. It was also an economic event, in the sense that the creation of a single Australian market with a single tariff policy and a single currency and a common regulatory framework had profound implications for the distribution of commercial advantage in the new nation. The families that were positioned to benefit from federation, that had operations across multiple colonies that would become more efficient under a unified national framework, had reason to support it. The families that derived their competitive advantage from the specific terms of the individual colonial arrangements had reason to worry about what federation might change. The history of the Federation campaign, as it is usually told, is a constitutional and political history. It is the story of the conventions, the drafting of the Constitution, the referenda, the negotiations between colonial governments about the terms of entry. It is a story in which the significant actors are the politicians and the constitutional lawyers and the colonial premiers who hammered out the terms of the Federal Compact, and that story is largely accurate, in the sense that those are indeed the people who did the formal work of federation. But alongside that formal history, there is a parallel history of commercial interest and strategic positioning that has received less systematic attention. The pastoral families that had operations across multiple colonies stood to benefit from the elimination of the intercolonial tariffs that added costs and complications to their operations. The banking families that operated across colonial boundaries stood to benefit from a unified monetary and banking framework. The trading companies that moved goods between colonies stood to benefit from the simplification of regulatory requirements. These interests did not determine the outcome of federation, in the sense of being necessary and sufficient causes. Federation had many drivers, and the economic interests of the colonial commercial elite were only one of them. But those interests were real, and they were represented through the networks of connection between the commercial elite and the political actors in the rooms where the constitutional decisions were made. Understanding who the major commercial families were and how their interests mapped onto the specific constitutional arrangements that were eventually adopted is part of understanding why the Constitution looked the way it did and why certain choices were made in the way they were made. The names that appear on the Federation campaign committees, in the list of donors to the Federation advocacy organizations, in the correspondence between the commercial families and the constitutional negotiators, are names that tell a story about the relationship between commercial interest and political outcome that the constitutional histories have not always fully incorporated. That story is not a story of corruption or of inappropriate influence in any simple sense. It is a story about how policy is made in any society where private wealth and political power exist in close proximity, which is to say in every society. The Australian story is interesting precisely because it is playing out in a period of such rapid development, when the stakes were high and the outcomes were genuinely uncertain, and the choices that were made had consequences that would shape the country for generations. The nights in the Australian bush in the 1890s were long and cold and dark in ways that are difficult to imagine from the comfort of a modern city. The station hands, who mustered the sheep in the morning and repaired the fences in the afternoon and gathered around the campfire in the evening, were living a life that the pastoral families who owned the runs rarely saw firsthand, that the London broking houses that financed those runs never saw at all, and that the colonial historians who wrote about the pastoral industry tended to romanticize rather than to describe with accuracy. The economic relationship between the pastoral workers and the pastoral families was, in the pre-Federation period, a relationship of significant inequality. The shearing rates were set through a combination of industry negotiation and market power that consistently favored the station owners. The terms of the workers' accommodation and food provision were determined by the owners. The possibility of organizing to improve those terms was complicated by the geographical dispersal of the workforce and by the legal framework that governed labor relations in the colonial period, a framework that had been developed in a context where the interests of the employing class had more weight than the interests of the employed. The shearers' strikes of the early 1890s, which were among the most significant episodes of industrial conflict in Australian history, were partly a response to the specific economic pressures of the Depression period, when the station owners were cutting wages to manage their own financial difficulties, but they were also a response to the structural inequality of the pastoral labor relationship, and to the growing sense among the workers that the legal and political system was organized in ways that consistently protected the interests of the employing families rather than theirs. The families that owned the stations and the families that financed those stations through the banking and wool broking systems were also the families that had the most influence over the colonial governments that were formulating the legal response to the strikes. The use of the native police and later the colonial military forces to protect strike-breaking operations was a decision made by colonial governments in which the interests of the pastoral families were heavily represented through both direct political influence and the network of social connection that linked the colonial governments to the colonial establishment. This does not mean the colonial governments were simply tools of the pastoral families. The situation was more complex than that. But it does mean that the decisions made in response to the shearers' strikes, which would have profound consequences for the relationship between labour and capital in Australia for the following decades, were made in a political context in which one side of the conflict had significantly more institutional influence than the other. Understanding that context, and understanding the families whose interests shaped it, is part of understanding how the Australia that emerged from the Federation period came to be the country it became. Now, let us return to the specific question of names and records. Let us think carefully about what it means to say that certain names were removed from the historical record, and what evidence we have for that claim, and what the alternative explanations might be. There are genuine cases of documents that were removed from archives. There are records of colonial land transactions, of banking correspondence, of commercial agreements, that researchers have been unable to find in the archives where they ought to be, where finding aids indicate they should be, but where they simply are not present. Sometimes this is the result of deterioration or misfiling or cataloging errors. Sometimes it is the result of something more deliberate. Families that had legal access to their own records, particularly in the period before modern archival protections were established, sometimes removed materials that they found inconvenient. Colonial officials sometimes destroyed records to protect themselves or their associates, and in some cases, records that were transferred between institutions have simply not survived the transfer. The more common phenomenon, and the one that has a larger effect on the shape of the historical record, is not removal but de-emphasis. The choice in compiling a history or writing a biography or editing a collection of papers for publication to focus on certain elements and to abbreviate or omit others. The choice that reflects not necessarily a deliberate intention to conceal, but a set of judgments about what is significant and what is not. Judgments that are themselves shaped by the social position and the values and the interests of the person making them. The colonial histories that were written in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were, for the most part, written by people who shared the values and to varying degrees the social position of the colonial elite they were describing. They were not critical histories in the sense of histories designed to expose the mechanisms of power. They were celebratory histories designed to document the achievement of the colonial period and to honor the men who had built the colonies. In that framework, the things that were significant were the outcomes, not the process, the achievements, not the means. And the things that were less visible, or that were visible, but seemed less glorious when examined closely, were the things that tended to be abbreviated or omitted. The result, over the generations of historical writing that have built on those foundations, is a picture of the colonial period that is more coherent and more flattering to the colonial elite than a complete picture would be. Not a picture that is simply false. A picture that is incomplete in particular directions. A picture in which the pastoral pioneers are more visible than the London brokers who financed them. In which the constitutional builders are more visible than the commercial networks that shaped the constitution they built. In which the individual achievement is more visible than the structural advantage that made that achievement possible. Recovering the fuller picture requires going back to the primary sources, to the archives and the private collections and the correspondence that has survived in various forms, and reading them with questions that the celebratory histories did not ask. Not to deny the achievements of the colonial period, which were real, not to reduce the history to a simple narrative of exploitation and hidden power, but to add back the dimensions that the simplified narrative left out, to understand how the colonial economy actually worked and who actually benefited from it, and why the distribution of benefit looked the way it did. The light over the blue mountains at dusk is a very specific quality of gold that painters have tried to capture for 2 centuries, and that photographs never quite get right. The eucalyptus trees that cover the ranges hold a volatile oil in their leaves that diffuses in the afternoon heat into a blue haze that gives the mountains their name and their particular atmosphere. Standing at the lookout at Katoomba and looking west into that blue haze, you can see, if you let your imagination reach, the country that the squatters pushed into in the 1820s and 1830s. Country that, from the coast, looked like a barrier, but that, once crossed, opened into the vast and productive grasslands of the interior. The families that first crossed the mountains and established themselves in the interior pastoral districts made fortunes that underwrote the development of the colony's commercial and cultural institutions for generations. Their names appear on the buildings of Sydney and Parramatta and the country towns that grew up around the pastoral districts. They appear in the founding membership lists of the colonial clubs and the colonial charities and the colonial churches. They appear in the marriage records, connected to each other through the same careful pattern of alliance that characterized every established elite in every part of the world in that era. And some of their names appear, with decreasing frequency, in the historical literature of more recent decades, because the histories of the last half-century have been less interested in celebrating the pastoral establishment and more interested in understanding the colonial period in its full complexity, including the aspects of that complexity that the earlier histories preferred to emphasize less. The dispossession of Aboriginal people from the lands that the pastoral families occupied. The conditions of the convict labor on which the early colonial economy depended. The treatment of the pastoral workers who brought the wool to market. The environmental consequences of the pastoral expansion for the landscapes that the runs occupied. These are not the stories that the pastoral families wanted told about themselves. They are not the stories that the celebratory histories told. but they are parts of the history, and recovering them is part of what serious historical inquiry requires. And in the process of recovering them, the names of the families become relevant not just as the names of achievers, but as the names of actors in a system that produced outcomes for many different groups of people, outcomes that need to be understood in their full range rather than just in the version that the families themselves found most flattering. There is one more pattern worth naming before this night's journey draws to its close, because it recurs across all the families we have been examining and makes the underlying logic unusually clear. The families that survived and thrived through the transitions of the colonial period were the ones that converted commercial advantage into social position before the commercial advantage itself became fragile. They placed sons in the legal profession and the colonial civil service and the banks. They married daughters to men from other established families in ways that extended the network into new domains. They became, in the language of the Victorian colonial establishment, old money, which is to say they became people whose wealth was assumed rather than discussed, whose connections were taken for granted, whose position in the colonial hierarchy required no justification because it was simply part of the landscape. The histories written in the late 19th and early 20th centuries acknowledge these families in general terms, but describe them in the language of individual achievement rather than structural advantage. That language is not false. The individuals were capable, but it focuses on the person and the achievement and omits the network that made the achievement possible, which means it tells part of the story in a way that makes the full story harder to see. The night has deepened while we have been talking. The hour is later than it was. Outside, wherever you are, the world has settled into its nighttime rhythms, the traffic quieter, the voices fewer, the darkness more complete. And the details of this history, the names and the dates and the specific mechanisms of colonial power, are beginning to soften at the edges and blur into the more general feeling that the story leaves behind. The feeling of depth, the feeling of a world more layered than it appears. The feeling that the names we know are not always the names that mattered most, and that the story we have been told is true as far as it goes, but does not always go quite far enough. That feeling is worth keeping. Not as a source of cynicism, not as a reason to distrust all official history, but as a reminder to ask the questions that the official history does not always raise. Who benefited from the decisions that were made? Who was in the room where those decisions were made, and why? What networks connected the people in the room, and what were those networks in the business of protecting? Where did the money come from, and where did it go, and who controlled the channels through which it moved? These are the questions that serious historical inquiry always asks, and they are the questions that produce the more complete and more honest picture of the past. Not a picture that reduces history to a conspiracy, or that sees power as always sinister and self-serving. But a picture that takes seriously the fact that power has structure, that structure has beneficiaries, and that understanding the beneficiaries is necessary for understanding the story. The families we have visited tonight, partially and incompletely, across the long sweep of the pre-Federation period, are part of Australia's story in ways that the popular histories have not always fully acknowledged. Their influence was real. Their network was real. The mechanisms through which they exercised that influence, the land grants and the water rights and the banking relationships and the wool-broking connections and the legal expertise and the marriage alliances and the club memberships, were real mechanisms with real consequences for the distribution of opportunity and wealth in the colonial society. And the historical record that reflects their presence and their influence is, as all historical records are, incomplete in ways that reflect the choices that were made about what to preserve and what to omit. None of this is a secret, exactly. The information is in the archives. The researchers who have looked carefully at the specific aspects of colonial Australian history that illuminate these questions have found the evidence. The picture that emerges from that evidence is richer and more complicated and, in some ways, more interesting than the simplified version. It is a picture of how a society is actually built, of how wealth and power and influence interact to produce the institutions and the distributions and the norms that define a society's character. Australia's character was shaped, in the colonial period by a process that was messier and more contingent and more influenced by the interests of specific families than the celebratory histories acknowledged. But it was also shaped by the democratic movements that pushed back against those interests, by the labour organising that won the conditions that became part of Australian identity, by the constitutional advocacy that created the framework for genuine popular government, and by the many people who came to Australia and built lives and communities that had nothing to do with the pastoral elite and its networks. The full history is all of those things together. The networks of the colonial elite and the people who pushed against those networks, the structural advantages of the established families and the democratic movements that contested those advantages, the official record and the private correspondence and the marriage records and the club membership lists. All of it together, in its complexity and its contradiction and its genuine human interest. Sleep now. Let the names settle. Let the networks dissolve back into the red earth from which the pastoral economy grew. Let the years of the colonial period, with their extraordinary pace of change and their extraordinary human drama, flow quietly back into the place where history lives when we are not actively thinking about it, somewhere beneath the surface of the present, shaping the world we wake up to every day without our being quite aware of exactly how. The Australia of the present is a product of the Australia of the colonial period. The wealth distributions and the institutional frameworks and the cultural assumptions that shape contemporary Australian life are connected, in ways that are sometimes visible and sometimes not, to the decisions and the networks and the specific mechanisms of power that we have been tracing tonight. The families whose names we have been following left marks that are still present in the landscape, in the street names of the capital cities, and in the architecture of the club buildings, and in the institutional cultures of the banks and the law firms and the pastoral companies that have adapted themselves across the generations to the changing conditions of Australian life. Those marks are not the whole story. They are not even the most important part of the story, in the sense of the part that most determines what Australia is and how it feels and what its people believe about themselves and their society. But they are part of it, and knowing they are there, knowing that the surface of the history conceals a depth that requires some work to see, is itself a form of understanding, a form of knowing that makes you a more careful reader of the present as well as the past. The continent is vast and old and full of stories. The colonial period is just a thin band across the surface of it, less than 2.5 centuries in a history that goes back 65,000 years and more. But it is the band in which the structures of contemporary Australian society were laid down, and understanding it in its full complexity is part of understanding where Australia is now and why. Rest now. Carry with you, into the sleep that is coming, the sense of the deeper story. The sense of the names that are there, and the names that are harder to find, and the networks that connected them all in the rooms where the decisions were made. The sense that history is always richer than the simplified version, always more interesting when you look into the layers, always more relevant to the present than it first appears. The night is very deep. The continent is turning slowly, under the same stars that turned over the colonial period, over the colonial gentry and their networks and their pastoral runs and their club rooms, over the workers in the shearing sheds and the merchants in the Sydney stores and the lawyers in their chambers and the bankers in their counting houses. Over all the ordinary lives and the extraordinary fortunes and the lost names and the recovered histories and the ongoing work of understanding who we were and how we got here. Sleep well. The history is patient. It will be there in the morning, as it has always been, waiting for anyone willing to look a little deeper than the simplified version. Good night. But before the night closes entirely, there are threads still worth following. Stories still worth telling, because the history of the families who shaped colonial Australia before Federation does not end at the moment of Federation itself. It continues, transformed but not ended, into the new national framework that replaced the colonial one. The families that had structured the colonial economy did not disappear when the Constitution was signed in 1901. They adapted, and in the adaptation, you can see, with particular clarity, how power works when the forms change but the substance is preserved. Think about what Federation actually changed and what it did not. It created a single national market, which benefited the families that operated across colonial boundaries. It created a federal government with new sources of taxation and new areas of regulatory authority, which created new points of contact between political power and commercial interest. It created a new national bureaucracy that needed to be staffed, and the families that had supplied the colonial administrations with educated and connected young men were well positioned to supply the federal one. And it created a national identity, a sense of Australianness that the new nation was in the process of defining, and the families that had been longest in the country and most prominent in its development had the most credibility to define what that identity should mean. The pastoral families of the pre-Federation period became, in the post-Federation period, the squattocracy, a word that carried more ambiguity than either pride or condemnation, used by different speakers to mean different things. To some, it was an honorific, acknowledging the pioneering achievement of the families that had opened up the interior. To others, it was an accusation, naming the structural advantage that those families had converted into lasting influence. The ambiguity of the word reflected the ambiguity of the historical situation. The squatting families had genuinely pioneered. They had also genuinely benefited from a legal and political framework that had been shaped, in part, by their own influence over that framework. In the new federal arrangement, these families found that their influence operated through different channels than it had in the colonial period. The pastoral associations, which had been significant institutions in the colonial period, became significant institutions in the federal one. The wool brokers and the rural banks, which had been central to the colonial pastoral economy, remained central to the federal rural economy. The legal firms that had served the pastoral families in the colonial courts continued to serve them in the federal courts and before the new federal administrative agencies. The club rooms where the decisions had been made informally in the colonial period continued to operate as informal decision-making venues in the federal one. What changed was the specific form of the political engagement. In the colonial period, the pastoral families had exercised influence primarily at the colonial level, through their representation in colonial legislative councils and their relationships with colonial governors and their control of colonial patronage networks. In the federal period, the same families, or their successors and descendants, needed to engage with a new national political structure. They did this, again, through the combination of formal participation and informal network that had characterized their colonial engagement. They ran candidates for federal parliament. They maintained relationships with federal ministers. They participated in the formulation of tariff and agricultural policy through the producer organizations that represented their interests. And they maintained the social networks, the clubs and the associations and the church organizations and the educational institutions through which the informal exercise of influence had always operated. The educational institutions of the late colonial and early federal period deserve particular attention because they are among the most visible and most durable mechanisms through which the colonial elite reproduced itself across generations. The grammar schools and the private colleges that were established in Sydney and Melbourne in the second half of the 19th century were not simply educational institutions. They were network maintenance devices. They were the places where the sons of the pastoral families and the banking families and the legal families were educated together, where they formed the friendships and the loyalties and the habits of mind that would sustain the network into the next generation. The families that founded and endowed these institutions were the same families that provided the network of connections they were designed to maintain. The donated chapel was not simply a religious gift. It was a statement of belonging and of priority, an inscription of the family's name into the institution that would educate the next generation of the colonial elite. The governance structures of these institutions, the boards and the councils that made the decisions about curriculum and staff and admissions, were populated by men from the same families whose sons attended the schools. The institutions were, in a very direct sense, self-governing entities of the colonial elite, managed for the benefit of the families whose network they were designed to maintain. This is not a critique of education or of the specific educational values that these institutions embodied. Many of them provided, and continue to provide, genuinely excellent education. But understanding them as network maintenance devices, as well as educational institutions, is part of understanding how the colonial elite structure persisted and adapted across the transition from colonial to federal Australia. The families that had established themselves in the colonial period used these institutions, among other mechanisms, to ensure that their children would enter adult life with the connections and the cultural capital that would allow them to maintain the structural position that the parents had occupied. The pattern is visible in the biographies of the significant figures of the early federal period. The prime ministers and the federal ministers and the high court justices and the senior bureaucrats of the first decades of federation were, to an extent that is striking when you look at it systematically, products of a small number of the elite educational institutions of the colonial capitals. They were, to a significant extent, connected by schoolboy friendships and family relationships and professional associations that traced back to the same networks that had shaped the colonial period. The federal period did not create an entirely new elite. It was substantially populated by the successors and the clients of the colonial one. The newspaper proprietors of the colonial and early federal period are another element of the network that deserves attention. The relationship between press ownership and political power in the colonial period was direct and explicit in a way that later journalistic conventions would make less comfortable. The newspapers of the colonial period were, in many cases, explicitly partisan operations, founded to advocate for specific political positions and commercial interests, and the men who owned them were often the same men who had those positions and those interests. The Wentworth connection to the Australian in the early colonial period was an example of this direct relationship. But the pattern continued and expanded throughout the colonial period. The major newspapers of Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane were owned by men who were embedded in the commercial networks of the colonial establishment and whose editorial positions reflected those networks. The families that owned the newspapers were often related by marriage or commercial connection to the families whose interests the newspapers defended. The editorials that advocated for pastoral lease extension or against land redistribution or for the specific terms of the tariff policy that the colonial commercial establishment preferred were not simply opinions. They were expressions of the interests of the networks in which the newspaper proprietors were embedded. This is not a specifically Australian phenomenon. It is the nature of press ownership in the 19th century everywhere. But in the colonial Australian context, where the elite was small and the networks were tight and the economic interests at stake were very large relative to the size of the society, the relationship between press ownership and network interest was unusually close and unusually consequential. The public discourse about colonial policy was shaped substantially by men who were part of the same network as the men whose policies were being discussed. The appearance of independent public debate was, in many cases, the reality of intra-network disagreement being conducted in public view. The specific families that dominated newspaper ownership in the colonial capitals are, in some cases, families whose names have become associated in popular memory with the newspapers themselves rather than with the networks that those newspapers represented. The Fairfax connection to Sydney journalism is the most well-known example, and it is a case where the family connection has not been obscured, where the name has remained associated with the institution across generations. But behind the Fairfax name, and alongside it, were other family connections and network relationships that shaped the character of the press in ways that the simple identification of an individual proprietor does not fully capture. The colonial port cities, Sydney and Melbourne primarily, but also Adelaide and Brisbane and Hobart and Perth, were the entry points through which the wealth of the pastoral interior was converted into the capital that financed the next round of pastoral expansion. The wool that was shorn in the shearing sheds of the interior arrived in the ports as bales. It was assessed by the agents of the London wool broking houses. It was auctioned in the wool stores. It was loaded onto the ships that took it to Britain. And the money that came back from Britain after the broking houses had taken their commissions and the freight costs had been deducted and the credit extended against the next clip had been netted out, was the money that made the colonial pastoral economy function. The physical infrastructure of this system, the wool stores and the auction rooms and the wharves and the shipping offices, was owned and operated by a relatively small number of firms that were embedded in the same networks that controlled the pastoral production and the London broking. The geography of the colonial ports, the specific arrangements of storage and handling and shipping that determined who could participate in the export trade and on what terms, was not neutral. It reflected the interests of the firms that had established themselves earliest and most firmly in the port infrastructure, and it created advantages for those firms that later entrants found difficult to overcome. The men who controlled the port infrastructure are among the least visible of the significant actors in the colonial economy because they operated in a world of commercial infrastructure and logistics that does not appear, in most historical accounts, as the glamorous stuff of colonial achievement. But the ability to move goods through the port system efficiently, to access the right wharves and the right storage facilities and the right shipping schedules, was commercially decisive in a way that few other capabilities matched. And the families that controlled that access controlled, in a structural sense, a significant part of the colonial economy's productive capacity. One of the most interesting and least examined aspects of the colonial network is the role of the professions, specifically the legal profession, in maintaining and transmitting the network across generations. In a society where economic advantage was substantially a product of legal entitlement, of the grant documents and the lease agreements and the banking contracts and the trade agreements that define the terms of economic participation, the ability to create and interpret and enforce those legal entitlements was genuinely powerful. And the families that had concentrated that ability in their hands, that had produced generation after generation of barristers and solicitors who served the colonial elite, occupied a structural position that was in some ways more durable than the pastoral wealth itself. Pastoral wealth was subject to the volatility of the wool market and the unpredictability of the Australian climate. It could be built up over a generation and lost in a single bad decade. Legal expertise and the social connections through which it was deployed was more stable. The family that had served the pastoral establishment for 2 generations had relationships of trust and familiarity that no newcomer to the legal profession could easily replicate. It had accumulated knowledge about the specific situations of its clients that gave it an informational advantage. And it had, through the pattern of professional service and social connection, become embedded in the network of the colonial elite in a way that made it structurally necessary, in the sense that removing it from the network would have required significant adjustment by everyone else. The specific legal families of colonial Sydney and Melbourne, the families that appear consistently in the records of the colonial courts and the colonial legislative councils and the colonial land grant process, are not well known in the popular historical consciousness. They are not the names that appear in the popular histories of the colonial period, but they were present consistently and consequentially at every significant moment of the colonial period, shaping the documents that determined who owned what and who owed what to whom, and what the government could and could not do about it. And that presence, though less visible than the pastoral families or the banking families, was in its way as significant. As we move through the last decades before Federation, the picture becomes both more complex and more visible. The emergence of responsible government in the Australian colonies in the 1850s, which gave the colonists genuine democratic control over their own legislatures, created new mechanisms through which the commercial elite exercised its influence. The informal mechanisms of the colonial period, the direct relationships between merchants and governors, the manipulation of the executive government through the commercial leverage that the colonial economy gave the pastoral families, these became less direct and less reliable as the democratic institutions matured, but they did not disappear, they adapted. The pastoral and commercial families moved into the new democratic institutions, running candidates for the new legislative assemblies, funding the political campaigns that shaped those assemblies, maintaining the relationships with ministers and civil servants that allowed them to influence the new democratic governments in ways that were more complex, but not fundamentally less effective than the older direct methods. The political parties that emerged in the colonial period, the free trade and protectionist parties that divided the colonial politics of New South Wales and Victoria, were not simply expressions of abstract economic philosophy. They were organized expressions of specific commercial interests, representing the positions that different segments of the colonial commercial elite found most congenial. The pastoral families that exported wool to Britain and feared the impact of protectionist tariffs on their relationships with their British markets were a natural constituency for free trade. The manufacturing interests that needed protection from cheaper British imports were a natural constituency for protectionism. The political debate between these positions was a genuine intellectual and policy debate, but it was also a debate between specific commercial interests that were organized, in part, through the same family and social networks that organized the commercial activities themselves. Understanding the political history of the colonial period requires understanding the commercial networks that the political positions reflected. The free trade politician, who was also a wool producer and a partner in a firm that handled the export trade, was not simply expressing an abstract preference. He was advocating for a policy that served his specific economic interests, and those interests were real and significant, and part of the calculation that went into the policy positions he took. That does not make him wrong in his advocacy. The free trade case was a genuine and often compelling one, but it makes the advocacy more explicable and more honest when it is understood in its full context. In the final years before Federation, as the constitutional conventions were drafting the document that would create the Commonwealth of Australia, the networks we have been tracing were fully engaged in shaping the outcome, not through the simple mechanism of dictating terms to the delegates, which would have been both crude and unnecessary, but through the more subtle and more durable mechanism of shared values and shared assumptions and shared interests that characterize the networks of the colonial elite. The men who drafted the Constitution were, for the most part, men of the colonial establishment, lawyers and politicians who had grown up in the network, who had been educated in the institutions it maintained, who shared the values it had developed over decades of colonial experience. The specific provisions of the Constitution, the allocation of powers between the federal and state governments, the protection of property rights, and the terms of the new federal tariff system and the provisions for banking regulation were not simply technical decisions about constitutional design. They were decisions that reflected the values and the priorities and the specific interests of the men who made them. Men who were, to a significant degree, the inheritors and the representatives of the networks we have been examining. This is not to say that the Constitution was a corrupt document or that the federal settlement was simply a tool of the commercial elite. The Constitution contained genuine democratic achievements and reflected genuine commitments to popular government and civil rights that went beyond the narrow interests of any particular class. But it also contained provisions that reflected the interests of the established classes and that shaped the distribution of power in the new federal system in ways that served those interests. Understanding the Constitution fully requires understanding the networks and the interests of the people who drafted it, which means understanding the colonial history that produced those people. The morning after the night of Federation, when the new national flag flew for the first time, and the new national anthem was sung for the first time, and the new federal government took its first official actions, the networks that had shaped the colonial period were still present. They were present in the Parliament that assembled in Melbourne as the temporary federal capital. They were present in the institutions that managed the Federation transition, the new federal judiciary, the new federal bureaucracy, the new federal financial arrangements. And they were present in the clubs and the drawing rooms and the boardrooms where the informal networks that had always been as important as the formal institutions continued to operate. The families that had been central to those networks in the colonial period remained, in many cases, significant in the federal period. Their specific roles changed. The pastoral economy itself was changing, becoming more mechanized, more subject to international commodity price movements, more dependent on the technical expertise that the new agricultural science was providing. The banking system was changing, becoming more regulated, more subject to federal oversight, less dependent on the informal relationships of trust that had characterized the colonial banking networks. The legal profession was changing, adding federal courts and federal procedures to the colonial ones, requiring new forms of expertise alongside the old ones. But the families adapted, as they had always adapted, taking their existing advantages and finding the new contexts in which those advantages remained relevant. The pastoral family that modernized its operations, The banking family that navigated the new federal regulatory environment. The legal family that developed federal expertise alongside its colonial base. The newspaper-owning family that expanded its reach as the new national discourse developed. All of them carrying forward, in transformed but recognizable form, the structural positions that the colonial period had created. The afternoon light in the old pastoral towns of New South Wales falls on buildings that were constructed in the Victorian era, two-story sandstone and brick structures with verandas and iron lacework that are now either heritage-listed or slowly deteriorating, depending on the resources of the town and the decisions of its current occupants. In those buildings, once the wool brokers' offices and the solicitors' chambers and the banks that served the pastoral economy of the interior, you can sometimes find, if you look carefully, the traces of the network we have been describing. A name above a door that appears in the land grant records of the 1840s. A carved stone bearing a family crest that connects to a family that appears in the bank records of the 1860s. A stained glass window in a local church donated by a family whose members appear in the club records of the colonial capitals. These physical traces are not monuments to the network in any deliberate sense. They are just what happens when families are present in a landscape for long enough and wealthy enough to leave marks, but they are part of the evidence. Part of the layer of material culture that, when read alongside the documentary record, produces the fuller picture of how the colonial economy was structured and who benefited from it. The pastoral towns themselves are part of that picture. Their existence, their location, their character, their current state of prosperity or decline, all of these reflect decisions that were made in the colonial period about where to run the stock routes, where to build the railway lines, where to establish the regional services that would sustain the pastoral economy. And those decisions were made, in many cases, in contexts where the interests of specific families had influence over the outcome. The town that was bypassed by the railway because its location served the interests of a competing family's land holding. The town that thrived because it was on the route that served the major pastoral operations of a well-connected family. The distribution of advantage in the colonial period was not random, and its legacy is visible in the landscape. The rivers of the interior, the Murray and the Darling and the Murrumbidgee and the Lachlan and the lesser tributaries that drained the pastoral districts were the arteries of the colonial pastoral economy in the period before the railways. Wool moved down these rivers in flat-bottomed paddle steamers to the port cities. Supplies and equipment moved up them to the stations. The control of river access, of the wharves and the storage facilities and the shipping rights on the inland waterways was a source of commercial advantage that the families who established themselves earliest on the rivers were able to exploit. The Murray-Darling River system became, in the 1870s and 1880s, the site of one of the more significant commercial competitions in colonial Australian history, as rival interests competed to establish the dominant position in the inland river trade. The families that emerged from that competition with the strongest positions were, again, the families that had the most extensive network of commercial and political connection, the families that could secure the favourable licensing arrangements from the colonial governments, and the favourable credit terms from the banks, and the favourable wharfage arrangements from the port authorities. The competition was real and sometimes fierce, but the outcome was again shaped by the network as much as by the individual enterprise. The river trade declined with the extension of the railway network, which provided faster and cheaper transport than the paddle steamers, and which eventually made the river shipping economically unviable. The families that had invested heavily in river shipping infrastructure had to write off those investments or adapt them to other uses. But the commercial networks that had developed around the river trade did not simply dissolve. They adapted, as they always adapted, finding the new context in which the accumulated relationships and the accumulated credit and the accumulated knowledge of the colonial economy remained relevant and productive. Sleep is almost here now. The details are softening. The names are beginning to blur together. The MacArthurs and the Wentworths and the Gibbs connection and the unnamed families of the Pilbara and the Queensland stations and the Melbourne club rooms, all of them settling into the deeper layer where history lives when we are not actively examining it. What remains, after the details have faded, is a sense of how things work, of how power operates in a society, of how families that achieve structural positions tend to maintain those positions across generations, adapting to the changing forms of economic and political organization while preserving the substance of their advantage, of how the formal record tends to preserve the visible face of power, the official titles and the signed documents and the public advocacy, while the informal network that supports and shapes that visible face tends to be less fully recorded and less fully remembered. This is not a uniquely Australian story. It is a human story, played out in the specific circumstances of a new colonial society that was developing with extraordinary speed in a vast and largely unmapped continent at the end of the 19th century. The specific mechanisms were colonial Australian, the land grants and the squatting licenses and the wool-broking relationships and the colonial bank networks. But the underlying logic of connected families maintaining structural advantage through the combination of economic position and social network and political influence is a logic that operates in every society and every era. Understanding it in the Australian colonial context is part of understanding Australia. Part of understanding where the present came from and why the distribution of advantage and opportunity in Australian society looks the way it does. Part of understanding the history that the celebratory accounts tell and the history that sits beneath those accounts in the footnotes and the private correspondence and the names that are harder to find than you might expect. There is something that the colonial period bequeathed to contemporary Australia that is not often identified as a bequest from that period specifically, but that becomes visible when you understand the network structure we have been examining. It is the culture of the gentleman's agreement, the informal understanding between people of established position that certain things are done in certain ways and that the deviation from those ways, while legally permissible, is not done. The shared values and shared expectations that govern the behavior of the members of the network without needing to be stated or enforced, because everyone who matters already understands them. This culture exists in contemporary Australian institutions in forms that are more muted and more democratized than the colonial versions, but that are recognizable as descendants of the same tradition. The network of informal understanding that governs the behavior of the boards of the major institutions, the shared assumptions about who is appropriate for certain roles and who is not, assumptions that are never stated formally but that shape outcomes in ways that the formal procedures of the institutions do not fully explain. The culture of connection, in which what you know matters but who you know often matters more. These are not simply Australian phenomena. They are found in every society with established elites, but the specific form they take in Australia reflects the specific history of the colonial period, the specific networks and the specific values and the specific mechanisms of advantage that the colonial elite developed and transmitted across generations. Understanding that history is part of understanding the present, part of understanding why Australian institutions and Australian society have the specific character they have, why they work the way they work, and for whom. Outside, wherever you are, the night has settled completely. The city or the town or the countryside is in its nighttime state, the energies of the day withdrawn, the surfaces cooled, the sounds reduced to the essential ones. And in that quiet, the history we have been moving through has a different quality than it has in the middle of the day, a more personal quality, a quality of real people and real lives and real decisions made in real rooms that are now empty, real networks that are now changed beyond recognition but whose effects are still present in the world you will wake up to in the morning. The colonial families of Australia are not simply historical curiosities. They are part of the genealogy of the present. Their decisions shape the country that later generations inherited. Their networks, adapted and transformed, are part of the social infrastructure of contemporary Australian life. Their stories, fully told, are part of the honest accounting that any society owes itself about how it came to be what it is. That accounting is still in progress. The historians are still working through the archives. The family researchers are still tracing the genealogies. The economic historians are still analyzing the data that reveals the distribution of wealth and opportunity in the colonial period. The result of that work, when it is brought together, will be a fuller and more honest account of how Australia was built, and by whom and at whose expense, and for whose benefit. Tonight we have traced some of the outlines of that fuller account. Not a complete picture, Not a definitive history, just some threads, some patterns, some names that appear in places where the official story does not always point, some connections between those names and the mechanisms through which power operated in the colonial period. Just enough to give you a sense of the depth of the story, the layers beneath the surface, the network beneath the visible face. Sleep now. Let the network dissolve back into the quiet. Let the names rest. The history will still be there in the morning, patient as it has always been, waiting for the next person willing to look carefully at the layers beneath the simplified version. Good night. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, the story is longer than you have been told, and it is still being told. One careful examination of one careful archive at a time, by people who know that the truth is almost always more interesting than the simplified version, and that the simplified version, however comforting, is never quite enough. The night deepens. The continent turns. The old networks sleep or do not sleep, transformed beyond recognition, but present in the institutions and the assumptions and the distributions that shape contemporary life. And you, wherever you are part of the present that those networks help to make, reading backward through the layers toward the beginning of the story, or as near to the beginning as any of us can reach. Sleep well. The history is patient. The morning will come. And the story will continue, as it always does, in the endless present tense of a past that has not finished speaking. Good night. There is a question worth sitting with a little longer before sleep comes entirely. Not a question that demands an answer tonight, just a question worth carrying. The question is this: what would it mean to tell the full story? Not just to know the names that are harder to find, not just to trace the networks that the simplified history omits, but to actually tell the story in a way that honored its full complexity, that gave weight to all the actors and all the consequences and all the mechanisms, without reducing it to a simple moral narrative of heroes and villains, or to a simple structural narrative of power and exploitation. What would that story look like? It would be long, much longer than any single telling of the colonial period that currently exists in popular form. It would require moving between the official record and the private record, between the formal documents and the informal correspondence, between the colonial level and the metropolitan level, between the individual biographies and the network analysis. It would require holding simultaneously the achievement story and the mechanism story, the genuine accomplishment and the structural advantage that made that accomplishment possible and that shaped who benefited from it. It would be uncomfortable in some ways. The families that have become, over the generations, simply part of the background of Australian life, whose names appear on buildings and institutions without anyone thinking very carefully about why those names are there, would need to be understood in a more complete way. Not condemned, not simply celebrated, understood. In the full complexity of what they did, and how they did it, and who they were doing it for. And it would be illuminating. Because the colonial period is not simply a story about the past. It is the story of how the present was made. The wealth concentrations and the institutional structures and the cultural assumptions and the informal networks that shape contemporary Australian life are connected, in traceable ways, to the decisions and the networks of the colonial period. Understanding those connections does not explain everything about contemporary Australia, but it explains some important things that are hard to understand without it. The people who have worked on recovering the fuller story, the historians and the economists and the genealogists and the archivists who have spent careers in the specific documentary world of the colonial period, have been doing important work. Not always work that receives wide public attention, because the academic monograph on the structure of the colonial wool trade is not a bestseller in the same way that the popular biography of a colonial governor might be. But work that builds the foundation for a genuinely fuller understanding of the period, layer by layer, as the archives are worked through and the connections are traced and the patterns are identified. That work continues. It will continue for many years. There are archives that have not been fully examined. There are private collections that have not been made available to researchers. There are data sets that have been assembled but not yet fully analyzed. There are connections between families and institutions and decisions that have been traced in part, but not yet brought together into the comprehensive account that the evidence, when fully assembled, will support. And that comprehensive account, when it eventually exists in a form accessible to general readers, will change the way Australians understand their colonial past. Not by overturning the achievement narrative entirely. The achievement was real. The pastoral expansion and the commercial development and the constitutional innovation of the colonial period were genuine achievements that deserve genuine recognition. But by adding to the achievement narrative, the structural story, the account of how the achievement was made possible by specific legal frameworks and specific financial arrangements and specific network connections that distributed the benefits of the achievement in very specific ways. The two stories together, the achievement and the mechanism, are more honest and more interesting, and ultimately more useful than either one alone. The achievement without the mechanism is a fairy tale. The mechanism without the achievement is a conspiracy theory. Together, they are history. Complicated, contingent, human history, in which people with specific interests and specific positions and specific network connections made specific decisions that had specific consequences, some intended and some not, some beneficial to many people, and some beneficial primarily to themselves and their network. The city of Melbourne in the 1880s was the most prosperous city in the Southern Hemisphere, possibly the most prosperous city in the British Empire outside London itself. The building boom that the combination of pastoral wealth and speculative investment and London credit had produced created a skyline of extraordinary ambition for a city that had been a small settlement only 4 decades earlier. The public buildings were extravagant. The private mansions of the commercial elite were extravagant. The department stores and the banks and the newspaper offices and the hotels were extravagant. It was a city that believed it would become one of the great cities of the world, and in 1880s Melbourne, that belief seemed entirely justified by the evidence. The families that had built that prosperity, and the families that had come to Melbourne to participate in it, occupied a social world of extraordinary density and complexity. The clubs and the churches and the charitable organizations and the sporting associations and the artistic societies and the schools and the professional associations, all of these were the institutions through which the social networks of the Melbourne establishment were maintained and extended and transmitted to the next generation. And all of them were, in various ways and to various degrees, institutions through which the commercial and the social and the political were intertwined. The men who sat on the board of the Melbourne Club were often also the men who sat on the boards of the major banks and the wool broking houses and the pastoral companies. The women who organized the charitable committees were often also the women who maintained the social connections that determined which families were invited to which occasions, which connections were sustained, and which were allowed to lapse. The committees of the major churches were populated by men and women from the same families that populated the committees of the major commercial institutions. All of it was one network, expressed through many different institutional forms. The crash that came in the early 1890s did not simply deflate property values and reduce commercial activity. It destroyed the specific social world that the 1880s boom had built. The families that lost everything, or that lost most of what they had built, did not simply experience a financial reversal. They experienced a social demotion that was in many cases permanent. The Melbourne of the 1890s was a diminished city, a chastened city, a city that had believed in its own exceptionalism and discovered that the exceptionalism had been built on credit that the underlying economy could not sustain. But not all the families that had been prominent in the 1880s lost everything in the 1890s. Some survived more or less intact. Some lost significant wealth but retained enough to maintain their social positions. And some, a smaller number but a significant one, actually strengthened their positions during the crisis by acquiring assets that the distressed sellers had no choice but to let go of at prices that reflected the distress rather than the long-term value of the assets. The families that survived the crisis best were, again, the families that had the most diversified positions and the most extensive metropolitan connections. The families that had borrowed heavily from the colonial banks and had concentrated their investments in the Melbourne property market that collapsed so dramatically were the most vulnerable. The The families that had maintained their pastoral interests and their London connections and that had not overextended into the speculative property development that drove the boom were better positioned to weather the contraction. The distribution of resilience was not random. It mapped again onto the network structure of the colonial elite. And the legacy of the crash, the redistribution of assets and opportunities that the crisis produced, continued to shape the distribution of wealth and position in the Melbourne commercial establishment for decades afterward. Some families that had been significant before the crash faded from significance afterward. Others that had been less visible in the boom years emerged from the crisis with enhanced positions. And the pattern of that redistribution reflected the network connections and the specific decisions that the crisis had revealed and tested. Now think about the women again, because we have moved through this history with them mostly in the background, and they deserve more than the background. The women of the colonial elite were not simply the social infrastructure of the network. They were, in many cases, active and intelligent participants in the management of the family's position and the family's resources. The management of a large pastoral station or a significant commercial enterprise in the colonial period required the contributions of the women of the family in ways that the formal records, which were organized around the legal fiction that the husband was the sole decision-maker, consistently understate. The station manager's wife, who managed the accounts and the staff relationships and the supply chains and the social obligations of the station when her husband was away on mustering or in the capital for the legislative session, was doing work of genuine economic significance. The merchant's wife, who managed the family's credit relationships and kept the books and maintained the correspondence with the London houses when her husband was travelling, was doing work of genuine commercial significance. And the drawing room hostess, who arranged the social occasions at which the connections were made and maintained and tested, who knew which families needed to be brought together and which needed to be kept apart, who understood the social landscape of the colonial elite with a precision that her husband often did not, was doing work that was as important to the network's function as any of the formal, commercial, or political activities. These women appear in the historical record inconsistently. When they wrote letters, the letters sometimes survived. When they managed accounts, the account books sometimes survived. When their contributions to the management of significant enterprises were acknowledged by their husbands or by their contemporaries, those acknowledgements are in the record. But the systematic and sustained contribution that the women of the colonial elite made to the maintenance and the development of the network in which they lived is not easy to trace in the existing historical literature, because the literature has not, for the most part, organized itself around the questions that would make those contributions visible. The history of colonial Australian women, particularly the women of the commercial and pastoral elite, is a field that has developed significantly in recent decades, but that is still, in many respects, under-examined. The biographies of the significant women of the period are fewer than the biographies of the significant men. The scholarly accounts of the women's specific contributions to the economic and social life of the colonial period are fewer than the accounts of the men's contributions. And the popular histories, which are where most Australians encounter the colonial period, are still substantially organized around the male figures whose names appear most prominently in the formal record. Recovering the full picture of the colonial elite requires recovering the full picture of the women who were part of it. Not just as wives and daughters and mothers, though they were those things, but as active participants in the network maintenance and the resource management and the social and cultural institution building that gave the colonial elite its character and its durability. The relationship between the colonial elite and the colonial government was not simply a relationship of influence and advocacy. It was also, in the most practical sense, a relationship of personnel. The men who served in the colonial civil service, who staffed the land grant offices and the customs houses and the colonial treasuries and the courts and the port authorities, were drawn disproportionately from the same social networks that produced the commercial and pastoral families. Not exclusively, because the colonial administrations also drew on men who had come to Australia in official capacities and who had no prior connection to the colonial commercial world. but the tendency for the significant positions in the colonial administration to be occupied by men who were embedded in the networks of the commercial establishment was real and was consequential. The men who assessed the land grant applications knew the applicants socially. The men who issued the squatting licenses were often members of the same clubs as the major squatters. The men who managed the colonial treasury were often drawn from families that had commercial relationships with the major colonial banks. None of this required explicit corruption. It did not require anyone to break the rules or to act improperly in the formal sense. It simply required that the people making decisions were the people who were most likely to make decisions in ways that reflected the values and the priorities of the network to which they belonged. This is not a specifically colonial Australian problem. It is a general problem of governance in any society where the professional class from which administrators are drawn is small and socially homogeneous. The colonial Australian case is interesting because the smallness of the colonial society made the problem unusually visible, and because the specific stakes, the distribution of the most valuable resource in a new colony, which was the land itself, made the consequences of the problem unusually significant. The land distribution decisions of the colonial period are still, in a sense, with us. The patterns of land ownership that were established in the colonial period through the grant system and the squatting licenses and the subsequent purchase and consolidation of holdings have persisted, in modified form, through the transformations of the federal period and the 20th century. The families that secured large landholdings in the colonial period have, in many cases, retained some version of those holdings into the present. The distribution of agricultural land in Australia today reflects, in its broad outlines, the distribution that was established in the first century of European settlement. That distribution was not random. It was the product of decisions made within a system that was biased, in various ways and to various degrees, toward the interests of the families that were best connected to the decision-making apparatus. Understanding that bias is part of understanding why the distribution looks the way it does. And understanding why the distribution looks the way it does is part of understanding contemporary Australia. The last thing to say, before the night closes completely, is something about the nature of the historical inquiry itself, about why it matters to look carefully at the layers beneath the simplified version of Australian colonial history, and what we should be trying to do when we look. We are not looking for villains. The families that shaped colonial Australia were not, for the most part, exceptional in their moral character. They were people of their time, operating within the norms and the expectations of a specific historical moment, making decisions that reflected the values they had been taught and the interests that the social position they occupied led them to prioritize. Some of them were genuinely admirable in aspects of their character. Some of them were genuinely problematic in other aspects. Most of them were complex in the way that people are always complex, capable of both the impressive and the disappointing, motivated by a mixture of principle and self-interest that is not easily resolved into a simple moral judgment. We are also not looking for a simple structural explanation that reduces colonial history to a machine for the production of elite advantage, grinding through the lives of everyone else to generate wealth for the families at the top. The colonial period was not that. The people who did not belong to the elite networks also had lives of genuine substance and genuine achievement. The colonial society generated real mobility, real opportunity, real scope for people of no particular family connection to make something significant of themselves through talent and effort and sometimes luck. The Australian ideal of the fair go has a genuine historical basis, not just in rhetoric, but in the actual experience of many people who came to Australia with nothing and built something real. What we are looking for is accuracy, the accurate picture. The picture that includes both the genuine mobility and the structural advantage, both the democratic achievement and the mechanisms through which specific families shape the terms of that achievement. The picture that honors the accomplishment without idealizing it, that acknowledges the limitation without reducing the whole to its worst elements. That accurate picture is more interesting than either the celebratory version or the cynical version. It is more useful. It is the picture that allows us to understand not just what happened, but why it happened as it did, which allows us to think more clearly about how the present works and how it might work differently. The names that are harder to find than you would expect are part of that accurate picture. The networks that the simplified history omits are part of it. The mechanisms of informal influence and structural advantage are part of it. And so are the achievements and the genuine contributions and the real costs and the lives of the people who were not part of the elite network but whose labor and whose presence and whose stories are also part of the full account of how Australia was made. All of it, together, in its complexity and its contradiction and its genuine human interest. That is the history worth telling. That is the history worth listening to, even at this hour. Even as the night deepens and the details begin to blur. Sleep now. The story is long and it is not finished, and it will continue to be told in the archives and the lecture halls and the documentary films and the long late-night conversations that history always generates in people who are genuinely curious about where they came from. You have been in the presence of some of its layers tonight. You have heard some of the names and traced some of the networks and understood something of the mechanisms through which power operated in the colonial period that made contemporary Australia. That is not nothing. That is the beginning of a more complete understanding. The beginning that each person has to make for themselves in the particular form that their particular curiosity takes. The history is patient. The archives are extensive. The questions that remain unanswered are numerous and interesting. And the people who are working on answering them are doing important work, quietly, in the particular way that serious historical inquiry always proceeds, one document at a time, one connection traced, one pattern identified, one more piece of the fuller picture assembled. Meanwhile, the night deepens, and the continent turns, and the old networks sleep or do not sleep, and the morning will come, and the present will continue, carrying within it, as it always does, the weight of the past that made it. Good night. Sleep well. The story is still being told. And somewhere in it, in a layer that is still being recovered, is the fuller picture of how Australia came to be what it is. Patient and present, and waiting for the questions that will finally bring it into the light. Good night. There is one last thread worth following before the silence takes over entirely. One last dimension of the story that the simplified history consistently underweights, and that, when you add it back in, changes the shape of everything we have been discussing. It is the dimension of indigenous dispossession. Not because it has been entirely absent from what we have been discussing, but because the mechanisms through which the colonial elite accumulated its position and maintained it were mechanisms that operated at their foundation on the dispossession of the people who had been in the country before any of the European networks arrived, the pastoral expansion that created the wool economy, the squatting that preceded the legal formalization of landholding, the grant system that distributed land to European settlers. All of these operated by treating the land as available, as crown land, as empty in the legal sense, which required treating the people already living on it as not having rights in the land that the colonial legal system was obligated to recognize. The families whose stories we have been tracing built their positions on land that was taken, not purchased, not negotiated, not acquired through any process, that the people who had been living on it for tens of thousands of years had agreed to or had any meaningful say in. Taken through the mechanism of a colonial legal system that defined property rights in terms that recognized only the European form of ownership and that therefore, by definition, could not recognize the forms of relationship to country that Aboriginal people maintained and that had governed the use and the meaning of the land for all the generations before European settlement. This is not a comfortable dimension of the story. It is easier to tell the colonial achievement narrative without it, because adding it in complicates the achievement in ways that the celebratory history prefers not to examine, but it is part of the story. It is, in fact, the foundational part of the story, because without the dispossession, the pastoral expansion could not have happened in the form it did. The land that the squatters ran their sheep on was land that Aboriginal people had been living on and managing for longer than any European civilization has existed. The water rights that the pastoral families secured were rights to water that Aboriginal communities had been using and relating to for generations. The timber and the stone and the mineral resources that the colonial economy exploited were resources that were embedded in landscapes that Aboriginal people had specific relationships with and specific protocols for managing. Recovering the full story of the colonial elite requires recovering this dimension of it, not to reduce the colonial period to a single story of dispossession, which would be as incomplete as the celebratory history that omits the dispossession entirely, but to understand the relationship between the mechanisms of colonial accumulation and the mechanisms of indigenous dispossession as aspects of a single process, in which the building of European wealth and the displacement of indigenous communities were not separate phenomena that happened to occur at the same time, but were structurally connected, the one depending on and producing the other. The families that accumulated the most land in the colonial period were the families that, in the most direct sense, displaced the most Aboriginal people. The largest pastoral runs occupied the most country. The occupation of that country meant the exclusion of the people who had been in it, sometimes through the mechanism of the native police, the colonial force that was deployed to clear Aboriginal people from pastoral land, sometimes through the mechanism of disease, which reduced Aboriginal populations by catastrophic amounts in the decades after European contact, sometimes through the mechanism of the frontier violence that accompanied the pastoral expansion in virtually every district where the squatters pushed into previously unoccupied country. The histories of the specific pastoral families, when they have been told at all, have tended to tell the pastoral story and the dispossession story separately, or to tell the pastoral story and acknowledge the dispossession in a paragraph or a footnote, as though the two were parallel narratives rather than aspects of a single history. But they are aspects of a single history. The wool clip that generated the wealth that built the Melbourne mansions of the 1880s was produced on land that had been taken from Aboriginal people who had no voice in the colonial legal system and no recourse in the colonial courts. The banking system that financed the pastoral expansion was financed in turn by London capital that saw no moral problem with investing in the productive capacity of a dispossessed landscape. The political system that formalized the landholding arrangements was a political system that did not include the people most affected by those arrangements. Adding this dimension back into the story of the colonial elite does not simply make the story darker, though it does make it darker. It also makes the story more complete and more honest. It allows us to see the colonial achievement in its actual context, which was a context of extraction from people who had not consented to the extraction and who bore its costs without sharing its benefits. And it allows us to understand, in a more grounded way, why the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia look the way they do today, why the distributions of wealth and health and life expectancy and opportunity are structured as they are, why the conversations about land rights and native title and the recognition of Aboriginal sovereignty carry such weight. The families whose names are harder to find than you might expect, the families whose influence over the colonial period was real and significant, but whose specific mechanisms of accumulation are less visible in the popular history, were families that operated in and through this system of dispossession. That is not the only thing to know about them, but it is part of what needs to be known. Part of the fuller picture, part of the honest accounting. The records of the frontier, the records of the violence that accompanied the pastoral expansion in virtually every district where European settlement pushed into previously unoccupied country, are among the most incomplete in the Australian archive, not because no records were made at the time. There were reports from native police commanders and letters from station managers and accounts in colonial newspapers and testimony before various colonial inquiries. But the records that were made were not always kept. Some were destroyed. Some were removed from official archives. Some were filed in ways that made them effectively inaccessible to researchers without specialized knowledge of where to look. The incompleteness of the frontier record is not random. It reflects the same dynamic that shaped the incompleteness of the records of the commercial network, the decisions made by the people who had most to lose from a full accounting of what had happened. The colonial governments that authorized the native police operations did not, for the most part, want detailed records of those operations preserved in accessible form. The station families that had benefited from the clearing of Aboriginal people from their pastoral land did not, for the most part, want detailed records of how that clearing had been accomplished, preserved in accessible form. and the broader colonial establishment that had built its prosperity on the dispossession was not enthusiastic about the kind of historical reckoning that complete records would have enabled. The work of recovering the frontier record, of piecing together from the surviving fragments of evidence a more complete picture of what actually happened in the pastoral districts during the period of expansion, is one of the more important projects in contemporary Australian historical scholarship. It is work that has been done, in part, for several decades, and that has produced accounts, in recent years, of the scale and the character of the frontier violence that have significantly revised the public understanding of the colonial period. The massacre maps and the frontier war histories that have been produced in recent years are the product of this recovery work, and they have, inevitably, been controversial because they complicate the pioneer narrative that the colonial period constructed about itself. The families that appear most prominently in the pastoral history of the colonial period, the families whose names are on the runs and the stations that the historical record celebrates, are also the families that were most directly implicated in the frontier process. The pastoral expansion and the frontier violence were not separate phenomena. They were the same process, experienced from different perspectives. Understanding the pastoral families in the full context of what their expansion required and produced is part of what it means to take the history seriously. Now, the night is very deep indeed. The layers of the story have accumulated. The names and the networks and the mechanisms and the dispossession and the records that are incomplete and the records that were removed and the stories that the simplified history tells and the stories that sit beneath those stories, all of it has been laid down in the way that sediment is laid down, layer upon layer, each layer adding to the depth and the complexity of what lies beneath the surface. What remains, when the details have faded and the specific names have blurred and the night has done its work, is something like an understanding. Not a complete understanding, not a final account, but a sense of the shape of the thing, of how power works and how it persists, and how the record of power is always incomplete in ways that reflect the interests of the people who held the power and the people who came after them who had reasons to preserve the simplified version of the story rather than the complete one. That sense of the shape is worth carrying. Not as a source of anger or of certainty about who was wrong and who was right in a history that is too complex for simple moral verdicts, but as a source of appropriate humility about the official narrative, the appropriate willingness to look beneath the surface, the appropriate recognition that the story we have been told is not the whole story, that the names we know are not always the names that mattered most, that the mechanisms that shaped the outcomes we inherited are not always the mechanisms that the celebratory history emphasizes. Australia is a country that is, slowly and imperfectly, in the process of reckoning with its colonial past in a more complete and more honest way than the simplified version allowed. That process is painful and contested and nowhere near finished, but it is happening. The archives are being opened, the records are being recovered, the connections between the colonial mechanisms and the contemporary distributions of wealth and opportunity and health are being traced. The stories that were in the footnotes are being moved toward the main text. That is work worth doing, worth supporting, worth understanding. And understanding it begins with knowing that there is a fuller story than the simplified version, that the names that are harder to find deserve to be found, and that the history of how Australia was made is more interesting and more important and more relevant to the present than the simplified version allows. Sleep now. The long night of Australian colonial history, with all its complexity and all its shadows and all its genuine achievement and all its genuine cost, is settling into the quiet that precedes understanding. The morning will come and the world will continue and the history will still be there, patient and extensive, and waiting for the next person willing to look carefully at the layers beneath the surface. You are that person, in your way. You have listened tonight. You have let the story move through you. That is not nothing. That is the beginning of the kind of historical consciousness that makes people better readers of the present, more aware of the mechanisms beneath the surface, more willing to ask the questions that the simplified version discourages. The families whose names are harder to find than you might expect are part of your history, whether you are Australian or not. They are part of the story of how a continent was shaped and how the world of the present was made and how the distributions of wealth and opportunity that characterize contemporary life came to be as they are. Knowing something about them, even in the incomplete and partial way that a night's worth of listening allows, is knowing something real and important. Carry that with you into sleep. Let the networks dissolve into the quiet. Let the names settle into the deeper layer. Let the history continue its patient work of being present in the world we wake up to every day, waiting for the questions that will bring more of it into the light. Good night. Sleep well. The story is longer than you have been told, and it is still being told. Good night. Before the silence takes over, one more thought. One more thread from the long tapestry of colonial history that deserves to find its place in the record before we let the night close. It is the thread of the people who pushed back. Who noticed the mechanisms and named them? Who organized against the structural advantages of the established families, and who built, through decades of effort and sacrifice, the countervailing institutions that gave the majority of Australians a share in the prosperity that the colonial period had concentrated in the hands of the few? The labour movement, the shearers' unions that formed and were broken and formed again across the pastoral districts of Queensland and New South Wales in the 1890s, the dockworkers' organisations that challenged the shipping companies in the port cities, the political advocates who pushed for land redistribution and for the progressive taxation that would reduce the concentration of inherited wealth, the journalists and the editors and the pamphleteers who wrote about the mechanisms of colonial power for audiences that had every reason to want to understand those mechanisms, the women who organised for suffrage and for the social reforms that would make colonial society more equitable. All of these are part of the full story, as essential to understanding the period as the networks of the colonial elite themselves. The history of the labour movement in colonial and early federal Australia is better preserved in the popular record than the history of the elite networks, because the labour movement created institutions and organisations that maintained their own records, and that had every reason to make those records visible. The trade union histories and the Labour Party histories and the biographies of the labour movement leaders are a significant body of literature that gives substance and visibility to the countervailing forces in colonial Australian society. But that history is often told separately from the history of the elite networks, as though the labour movement and the colonial establishment were parallel stories rather than aspects of a single dynamic. The full picture requires holding both simultaneously. Understanding the shearers' strike of 1891 requires understanding the pastoral network against which the shearers were striking. Understanding the banking reform debates of the Federation period requires understanding the banking families whose interests the existing system served. Understanding the land reform movements of the late colonial period requires understanding the land concentration that those movements were attempting to address. The dialectic between the established networks and the democratic movements that challenge them is the most important dynamic of the colonial and early federal period. It is the dynamic that produced the specific character of Australian democracy, with its combination of genuine popular government and significant concentration of economic power. It is the dynamic that produced the specific character of Australian social policy, with its relative generosity in some areas and its specific limitations in others. And it is the dynamic that produced the specific distribution of wealth and opportunity that contemporary Australians have inherited from the colonial period. Understanding that dialectic requires understanding both sides of it, the elite networks and the democratic movements. The mechanisms of advantage and the mechanisms of resistance, the families whose names are harder to find, and the families and organizations that challenge their dominance. The full picture is made of all of them together, in their conflict and their accommodation and their mutual shaping of the society that both produced. That full picture is the history worth telling, worth listening to, worth carrying into sleep and into the morning that follows and into the long days of a present that was made by all of it. Sleep now. The night is deep and the history is patient, and the morning will come and the story will continue. Good night. The stars that turn above Australia tonight are the same stars that turned above the colonial period, above the club rooms and the counting houses and the shearing sheds and the drawing rooms and the legal chambers where the shape of the country was being decided. They do not know the names we have been tracing. They do not carry the record of the networks we have been following. But they were there, turning in their patient circuits, through all of it. And they are here now, above wherever you are, turning still. The world is made of layer upon layer of history, each layer shaping the one above it, each generation living in a present that was formed by choices made in a past they did not choose. The colonial families, whose names appear in the records we have been examining, made choices that shaped the present we inhabit. Understanding those choices, and the networks and the mechanisms and the specific advantages and the specific costs through which they were made, is part of being honest about where we are and how we got here. That honesty is not comfortable, but it is clarifying. It is the kind of clarifying that allows a society to see itself more accurately and therefore to navigate its future more wisely. The Australia that takes its colonial history seriously, in its full complexity, is better equipped to address the legacies of that history and to build more equitably on the foundation that the colonial period created. Rest now. Let the layers settle. The history is patient and it will be there in the morning, and it will continue to be examined and recovered and told more fully as the work proceeds. You are part of the world that history made, and understanding it is part of understanding yourself and the society you are part of. Sleep well. Good night. There is one more dimension of the colonial network that has not been fully examined tonight, and it deserves its place in the record before the silence finally takes over. It is the dimension of religion. Not doctrine, not the specific theological positions that divided the colonial churches from each other, but the institutional dimension. The way the colonial churches functioned as network nodes, as gathering places for the elite, and as mechanisms for the legitimation of the social arrangements that the elite had constructed. The major Protestant denominations of colonial Australia, the Anglican and the Presbyterian and the Methodist churches, were not politically neutral institutions. They were embedded in the social fabric of the colonial establishment in ways that reflected and reinforced the network structures we have been tracing. The men who sat on the vestry committees and the church boards and the educational committees that governed the church schools were often the same men who sat on the boards of the pastoral companies and the colonial banks. The philanthropy that built the church buildings and endowed the church schools came disproportionately from the families of the colonial elite. And the clergy who served the major congregations of the colonial capitals often moved in the same social circles as the congregation's most prominent members, developing relationships of mutual regard that were personally genuine, but that also served the institutional interest of both parties. The church connection mattered for the network in several ways. It provided a venue for the social contact that maintained the network's cohesion, separate from the club rooms that were exclusively male and the commercial venues that were explicitly transactional. The Sunday service and the church committee meeting and the church social event were occasions where families interacted in a register that was neither purely commercial nor purely personal, a register that reinforced the sense of shared values and shared community that gave the network its social glue. The church connection also provided a mechanism for the legitimation of the social arrangements that the colonial elite had constructed. The minister who preached that prosperity was evidence of divine favor, that the established order reflected a natural hierarchy ordained by providence, that the obligations of the wealthy toward the poor were best discharged through private charity rather than through the redistribution of wealth or the reform of the systems that produced the inequality, was not a cynical tool of the establishment. He was, almost certainly, a sincere believer in what he preached. But what he sincerely believed happened to be, in its social function, a form of ideological support for the existing distribution of wealth and power. The Catholic community of colonial Australia occupied a different position in this picture, predominantly Irish in origin, predominantly working class in composition, predominantly associated with the convict and labouring populations rather than the pastoral and commercial elite. The Catholic Church in the colonial period was not embedded in the network of the colonial establishment in the same way that the major Protestant denominations were. The Catholic community was, to a significant extent, the community that the colonial establishment had built itself against, as much as with the sectarian divisions of colonial Australia. The tension between the Protestant establishment and the Catholic working class were not simply theological divisions. They were social and class divisions, mapped onto religious identity in ways that reflected the specific composition of the colonial population and the specific history of the colonial settlement. The Protestant families that dominated the colonial elite were not unaware of this. The sectarian dimension of colonial Australian social life, the explicit and sometimes virulent anti-Catholicism that characterized significant elements of the colonial establishment, was not simply irrational prejudice, though it was also that. It was a social mechanism, a way of marking the boundaries of the in-group and the out-group, of distinguishing the established families from the newer and less socially connected populations. The Catholic Irish labourer was not simply a person of a different religion. He was a person of a different class, a different origin, a different relationship to the colonial power structure. The religious difference marked and reinforced the class difference. Understanding the role of religion in the colonial network does not require reducing it to a simple instrument of class interest. The faith of the colonial families was, for many of them, genuine and important, and not reducible to its social function. But understanding the social function of the institutional churches in the colonial period is part of understanding how the network operated and how its values were transmitted and legitimated across generations. The question of who wrote the colonial histories and why they wrote them the way they did is a question that sits just beneath the surface of everything we have been discussing tonight. Because the histories that were written in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were not neutral accounts. They were produced by people who had specific relationships to the colonial establishment, specific reasons to tell the story in particular ways, specific audiences whose expectations shaped the choices they made about what to include and what to emphasize and what to leave in the margins. The first professional historians of Australia were, for the most part, men of the educated class who had been trained in the British and European historical traditions and who brought to the Australian material the assumptions and the values of those traditions. They believed in the importance of political and constitutional history. They believed in the significance of great men and great decisions. They believed in progress, in the idea that the colonial period represented a movement from a less developed to a more developed state of civilization. And they had professional and social relationships with the families and the institutions of the colonial establishment that made it, if not impossible, at least genuinely difficult for them to write accounts that were fully critical of the social structures those families and institutions had created. This is not a uniquely Australian phenomenon. The social embeddedness of historical scholarship in the societies it studies is a general condition of the discipline, and it has been the subject of sustained methodological reflection in the historical profession for several decades. But in the specific Australian case, where the colonial period was recent and the families that had shaped it were still prominent, and the social networks that had characterized it were still largely intact, the embeddedness was unusually direct and unusually consequential for the shape of the historical record. The revisions to that record that have been undertaken in more recent decades, the work of social historians and economic historians and feminist historians and Indigenous historians who have approached the colonial period with different questions and different methodological frameworks, have produced a substantially different picture of the colonial period than the one that the early professional historians constructed. Not a completely different picture, the foundational facts have not changed. But the significance attributed to different aspects of those facts, the analytical frameworks through which they are interpreted, and the range of experiences and perspectives that are treated as worthy of historical attention have changed significantly. The work of revision is ongoing. The picture that will eventually be produced, when the various strands of the current historical scholarship are brought together into a comprehensive account, will be richer and more complex and more honest than either the celebratory version of the early historians or any single alternative account. It will be a picture that takes seriously the achievement and the mechanism, the democratic aspiration and the structural inequality, the pioneer narrative and the dispossession, the visible names, and the names that are harder to find. That picture is worth waiting for, worth contributing to in whatever way one's particular position and particular capabilities allow, and worth beginning to encounter in the partial and fragmentary way that a night's worth of listening makes possible, as a way of developing the historical sensibility that makes one a better reader of the present. The last light of this particular night, the last thought before the silence takes over, is something simple, something that all the complexity we have been moving through points toward, rather than away from. The past is present, not in a mystical sense, in the most practical and material sense. The decisions made in the colonial period are embedded in the physical landscape of contemporary Australia, in the patterns of land ownership and the locations of cities, and the infrastructure of roads and railways and irrigation systems and ports. They are embedded in the institutional structures, in the specific character of the banks and the law firms and the pastoral companies and the media organizations that descended from their colonial predecessors. They are embedded in the cultural assumptions, in the specific ways that Australians think about land and wealth and fairness, and the proper relationship between individual achievement and social structure. Understanding how those decisions were made, by whom and through what mechanisms and in whose interest, is part of understanding why the present looks the way it does. It is not a complete explanation of the present. The present is the product of many forces beyond the colonial decisions. But the colonial decisions are part of what produced the present, and ignoring them, or receiving only the simplified version of them, leaves the present partially unexplained, and therefore partially misunderstood. The families whose names are harder to find than you might expect left marks. In the landscape and in the institutions and in the distributions of wealth and opportunity that contemporary Australians have inherited. Those marks are part of the world you will wake up to in the morning. And knowing something about how they came to be there, even in the incomplete way that tonight's journey allows, is knowing something real and useful and worth carrying. Sleep now. The history is patient. The morning will come, and the story will continue as it always does in the present tense of a past that has not finished speaking. Good night.